Good morning. My name is Peter Arlett. I'm head of Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at the European Medicines Agency, and it's my pleasure to welcome you from the EMA building in Amsterdam to the ACT EU multi-stakeholder meeting on decentralized clinical trials. I'd like to just start by handing over to my colleague Marianne Wood with some housekeeping notes. Marianne, please.
Good morning, all. My name is Marianne Wood. I'm Programme Support Officer at the agency. Please note that the meeting is being live broadcasted and recorded. May I kindly ask you for on-site participants to mute the microphones after speaking, enabling the camera to swivel back to the speaker. Many thanks.
Thanks, Marianne Wood. It's my great pleasure to introduce Emma Cook, Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, for some opening remarks. Emma, please.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Marianne. And I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person today. I welcome you to the EMA building, and I wish you a very successful conference. My name is Emma Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, and I am delighted to open this ACT EU multi-stakeholder event on decentralized clinical trials. This event has been driven by the EU Decentralized Trials project, which will deliver a recommendation paper on decentralized clinical trials, and the work is being guided by the Clinical Trial Coordination Group and overseen by ACT EU. So this event aims to get stakeholder input to a reflection paper on decentralized clinical trials. It's an important deliverable of ACT EU, the HMA, EC, EMA joint initiative for accelerating clinical trials in the EU. And the idea is that we would facilitate the development and publication of key methodological guidance and strengthen the link between innovation and scientific advice. Today, more than ever, regulators and researchers alike are aware of how public health emergencies can cause major disruptions to clinical trials. To adequately address these situations, we must embrace modern ways of working, understanding the role that novel technology plays in emerging public health threats to ensure appropriate regulatory support and oversight. A clear example of these modern approaches was how the recovery trial used smart trial design and tapped into existing health data sets to become the most successful trial in COVID-19 therapeutics to date. And this trial showed in little more than 3 months that dexamethasone could cut deaths by a third for critically ill COVID-19 patients. And if you remember when these trial results came out, this was at a time when there was nothing, when we had a new disease and there was really nothing that was working. So the impact of this trial was immense. If we think about innovation in clinical trial methods and regulatory supervision, we see the promise this holds to deliver better medicines to patients and address key public health goals. And we must see that innovation is only possible through deep collaboration across borders and among all stakeholders in the clinical research community. And this is why we're doing the event here today. Facilitating a dialogue on clinical trials with decentralized elements is key if we want to demonstrate the benefits of medicines through faster, more effective, and more efficient research involving broader groups of patients and researchers. I was really struck by a presentation I heard just about a year ago, how the pandemic made it necessary to move from site-based clinical trials to more decentralized approaches. Because it had to. And while there may be some limitations from regulators, if it's done properly, we can really expect the benefits for patients to be immeasurable. Equitable access to trials irrespective of locations, transport costs and difficulties minimized, reduction in stress, patients with rare diseases having access to global sites, My message to you is that we have seen that decentralized clinical trials can work in a pandemic setting because they have to. Let's make sure that we can serve the patients in peacetime also. So thank you for your engagement and collaboration. I hope you have lively and productive discussions over the course of the day. This is a very important project that we really need to move forward. And I would like to pass the floor over to Peter Arlett, the head of the Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at EMA. Thank you very much, and I wish you a wonderful discussion.
Thanks very much, Emma. And we have a full room here in the EMA conference suite. So it's great to see all the colleagues here. With that, I move straight on to introduce Griet Mouche, who is working for the Belgian Federal Medicines Agency, and perhaps critically for our session today, is the Vice Chair of the CTCG. So over to you, Griet.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this introduction, and thanks a lot also to Emma Cook to be with us today, and thanks to Emma also for hosting and making this event possible. I'm really happy to see all of you here because it's a multi-stakeholder meeting indeed. We have a lot of partners already from the regulatory perspective, a large variety of actors, and we are very happy to see also the sponsors, the CROs, but also the patients and investigators. So it will really be a really good workshop. I will start by introducing 3 colleagues who really worked hard on this, and I really would like to thank them already in advance. Happy to introduce to you Ditte Zerlang-Christensen. She works as project manager at the Danish Medicines Agency and leads European alignments in the regulatory landscape of clinical trials. She's chair for the project and portfolio management within the CTCG, the Clinical Trial Coordination Group, and together with the colleague Stina Löffling from the Swedish MPA, she's responsible for the project management in this EU DCT project. So and Ditte will give the introduction, and then we have Monique All and Solange Levison, who will give the authority perspective where we stand for the moment. So Monique All works as coordinating advisor specialized on clinical trials and clinical investigations at the Central Committee on Research Involving Human Subjects, the CCMO, which is rather known here in the Netherlands. She's member of the CTCG group and the Clinical Trial Expert Group and the Clinical Investigation and Evaluation Working Group. And together with Solange, she is the scientific coordinator of the EU-DCT project team. Solange Levison works as a scientific staff member at the Central Committee at the CCMO in the Netherlands, to keep it a bit shorter. So very welcome to the 3 of you, and Ditte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Griet. Could we have the slide? Yeah. Okay, so yes, today's topic is decentralized trials, and we've been looking very much forward from the project team to discuss this topic with you all through days. So we will be seeking to leverage on technological and scientific progress in order to try and bring the trials home to patients, to make it more easy to become a trial participant. And so we'll be speaking about a lot of aspects around procedures at home, the electronic informed consent process, and shipping medical products directly to patients' home. And next slide, please. And that was the introduction. So yeah, we'll be going much more in detail throughout the day. And if you take the next one, please. Yeah, we have to remember when we are also employing a new innovative methodology, so decentralizing the clinical trials, it does have a big impact on the clinical trial environment. And that's where, if you have the normal situation on the left, that's where the patient is coming in, you're having a face-to-face interaction with your investigator, and you're collecting the data centrally. So we are doing some major changes on the right-hand side when we are then collecting data in a more decentralized ways. and we are disconnecting a little bit also the patients with the investigator. So it does have some impacts, and we just have to reflect on both opportunities and then challenges. Next slide, please. So this major impact is the reason why we've come together in this project to draw up recommendation and trying to provide with you with a harmonized perspective from the regulatory European Medicines Regulatory Network. So we are working focused to try and provide you with this as much as possible harmonized perspective in the recommendation paper, where our main objectives are to look at implementing the decentralized elements with a trial participant-centered and risk-based approach, to make sure we have maintained the investigator and sponsor oversight, and that we are producing reliable and robust data fit for purpose. So, because these are still in somewhat early days for decentralized trials, we do have some national provisions, I think you're all aware, that just in some points do not allow us to harmonize as much as we want to. So for that reason, we'll be drawing up a national provisions overview that will complement the recommendation paper. So what you'll see in the recommendation paper is going to be the direction in which we want to move. And then you can see all the national provisions in this complementary oversight. So we are doing everything we can to try and target publication at the end of the year. And it will form the best practice for European clinical trial authorization and inspection. It is important to say it's not a guideline. It is a recommendation paper, and it is a first step towards a harmonized approach. And we are expecting that we'll update that as knowledge and experience evolve. Next, please. Yeah, so this is to illustrate to you that we are really doing everything we can in this project to provide you with the cross-disciplinary recommendations. So you see here the broadness of our project team. So the main drivers of the project, you can say, are the CTCG representing the clinical trial experts, ethical experts represented by CTEG, and the GCP-IVG representing the GCP inspectors. But we are also drawing in a lot of other perspectives broadly across our network. So we have inputs incorporated by the scientific advice experts, by the data methodology working party experts, and by pediatric experts. We are also working as part of our project team with patient representatives and healthcare practitioners, where some of them are actually taking part in the panel discussion later today. And because many of our objectives evolve around a patient-centered approach and in maintaining investigator oversight, this panel discussion is really key for us, and we're looking very much forward to it. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I was just, I missed in the last one to say, we have 45 experts working in this very dedicated project team, and you have 25 of them on site today who will engage with you in the discussions going on. So just to summarize the scope of today's meeting, we are looking very much forward to discussing with you, going into looking at the opportunities in this field, but also looking a little bit on the challenges with the view to see, can we manage and can we risk mitigate some of the challenges that might be there, so we can really facilitate and create a harmonized approach to use facilitate implementation of the decentralized elements in the European clinical trial environment, maintaining trial participants' safety, right, and dignity, and make sure we produce reliable and robust data that are fit for purpose. So with that, I'll give over to my colleagues, Monique and Solange, who are really doing a tremendous job of leading and pulling together our recommendation paper.
Okay, thank you, Ditte. First of all, I want to say hello to everybody here at the EMA building, but also good morning to everybody at home or at the office viewing us remotely. How nice is that? And I think that it's already said by Ditte that we really aimed of having the paper out end of this year. And I have to say that the project team has worked very, very hard to establish that. But because we want to have it out this year, we had to limit the scope a little bit as well. So the focus is really on certain specific decentralized elements in the conduct of the clinical trial. Of course, we all know that the GDPR is challenging. It's a very important aspect if you talk about decentralized clinical trials. It's mentioned in the paper, but you will not see any provisions with respect to GDPR specific requirements, just to be clear. Principle and rules for traditional clinical trials. Of course, they are similar for clinical trials with decentralized elements. They will not be repeated unless we think it's necessary to mention them again. So it fits a purpose within the recommendation paper. To be honest, we were trying to come up with a definition of decentralized clinical trials, decentralized elements, remote clinical trials, etc. But we were a little bit caught in words, and then we were thinking, probably we all know what we mean by it, so we don't give a definition in this paper yet. And it already said, when time goes by, we will get more insights, new insights. We have more experience, and the paper will evolve along that. So that's where some points of attention, also to manage expectations when the recommendation paper is out. Next slide, please. So what is in the paper? Here you can see the content. First, normally the introduction, scope, and the general consideration. I will touch the topic of general consideration later on. We have a chapter on clinical trial oversight, roles and responsibilities, informed consent process, and delivery of medicinal products and administration at home. These 3 chapters will be presented by my colleague Solange. And then we have 3 other chapters: trial-related procedures at home, defining and handling source data, and trial monitoring, and that will be handled by me again. So next slide. So the general consideration, I have picked some of them who are in the paper, and well, we thought we have to start with the basic principle, just that we are all on the same level, of course, that rights, safety, and well-being of trial participants shall be protected and prevail over all other interests. Of course, we have EU legislation, we have national legislations, there are other guidances, guidelines, and those have to be respected. And when there are differences between our harmonized approach in the paper, they will come in the appendix with national provisions. But to be clear, we can't address all topics in this appendix. So we have mentioned a few. As an example, for instance, is electronic informed consent possible in your member state, as an example. But so for certain topics, it will come in the appendix with the recommendation paper. Well, and the third one is a very important one, I think, the involvement of patients and investigators in an early and sustained manner. If you are planning your clinical trial, reach out to patients and investigators to see if what you are intended to implement in your clinical trial, if that's feasible, is that according to the patient and investigators' needs. And that will only benefit, especially when you are conducting the clinical trial after it has been authorized by the regulators, of course. Then for certain selected decentralized elements, there might be a chance that the transfer of the burden is moved from investigational side to the trial participant or to the investigator itself. Well, that should always be weighed against the benefits of using these decentralized elements, and a rationale should be given in the protocol. We also find it important to do a risk-benefit assessment, and of course not for all elements but focusing on those selected decentralized elements which might have an impact on scientific validity, patient safety, benefit risk, or protection of participants' rights. Next slide, please. Maybe needless to say, but we will do it, that appropriate training is essential. If trial procedures have to be performed at another place at the clinical trial site, the persons who are responsible for conducting these procedures should receive appropriate training and guidance how to do it. If third parties are visiting trial participants at home, then we should be sure that they are qualified to do so. And that might be also different among member states what the qualification should be. In the general consideration, we'll touch a little bit on the topic of generating reliable and robust data. So we touch a little bit on selection bias, internal validity, and also on how to deal with missing data. As you all know, with decentralized trials, IT is key. So there is also some considerations with respect to that AD devices, technology developed and utilized should be fit for purpose and should be compliant with the GCP Inspector Working Guideline on Computerized Systems and Electronic Data and Clinical Trial. This guideline has not been published yet, but we hope it will be published soon, and therefore we already refer to this guideline as something you should comply with. And then finally, a contingency plan should be in place to minimize the impact of any risk. For instance, if there's malfunction of a digital tool, or if there is a lack of web connection, just a few examples. And Solange will take over. Next slide.
Thank you. Good morning also from me. I will talk about the next chapter, that is on clinical trial oversight and the roles and responsibilities. When decentralized elements are implemented in a clinical trial, in general, it means that the participants will come less frequent to the trial site, and there's an increase of the involvement of third parties, and there's an increase in the use of digital tools to collect data, and there's an increase of incoming data from different sources. The challenge is that while more tasks are delegated to third parties, the responsibilities are, as described in the GCP E6, stay the same. So in the protocol should reflect that the sponsor and the investigator are in control of their respective areas of responsibilities. So in the paper, considerations are given how this control can be maintained, and so that oversight on the safety and the well-being of the participants and the reliability of the data can be kept. I will highlight the main topics in this chapter. First of all, documentation is very important. It should be well documented which tasks are conducted at what place and when and by whom. And any trial-related task that is delegated to a third party should be specified in a written agreement. And well, it's not practical that the investigator is involved in all the contractual arrangements with third parties, but then the contract between the sponsor and investigator should clearly mention the contractual arrangements between the sponsor and the third party, so that if the delegated task to the third party, so that the investigator can agree to these delegated tasks. And as mentioned by Monique, we say in the general considerations that the investigator should be involved in an early stage at in the designing of the clinical trial with decentralized elements. So in that way, it's already early on clear that the investigator can accept that some tasks are delegated to third parties when these tasks are related to medical care. A second point of attention is that there should be a clear communication plan between the different parties involved. All parties should have access to all information needed to fulfill their duties and responsibilities related to the clinical trial. And yeah, of course, this plan should cover also emergency situations so that the relevant parties know when to act without delay. And on the other side, the trial participant also has to know who to contact in acute cases, but also in a case of device failures or questions on home visits, etc. A third point of concern is the constant flow of information that may come in when digital tools are being used. And there should be a clear procedure how to handle this continuously incoming data. And the priority is to capture to capture and assess treatment emerging adverse events, and timely without creating an unacceptable burden for the investigator and the trial participant. And the trial participant should also be informed what will be done with the information that is transmitted continuously by a device that he is using at home, so that he knows that the investigator is not continuously reviewing these data, and that the participant should contact the investigator when something is going on, and not just wait that the investigator will contact the participant. Yeah, that is about this chapter. Next slide, please. And the other chapter is about the informed consent process. When decentralized elements are implemented, there are different ways of the informed consent process can take place. One can think of the interview that can be remote or on site, and the patient information can be digital or on paper, or it can be a video, and the signature can be electronic or with wet ink. So there are many forms possible, but the chosen form of the informed consent should be suitable for the design of the trial and the trial population, and the risks and burdens and the potential benefit related to participating in a clinical trial. So it should be a risk-based approach. What aspects can be done remotely? With regard to the interview, it's considered essential that the face-to-face communication takes place between the potential trial participant and investigator. And if the discussion is done in a digital meeting, it's recommended that it takes place in real time, where the parties are able to both see and speak with each other via audio and video. And the face-to-face contact should, of course, allow for asking questions and include also confirmation of the identity of the participant and the investigator. There may be cases where the contact via telephone, email, or chat only is justifiable. But for example, with a low intervention clinical trial with a very large population. But the deviation from the face-to-face communication in real time should be motivated in a clinical trial population. The use of different kind of media can enhance the comprehension of the clinical trial participant. But when these electronic methods are used, the sponsor should be aware that there may be participants that cannot or prefer not to use this technology. So alternative methods of the patient information should be always available. Anyway, the trial participant should always be able to store and also retrieve the patient information at any time. So when it's digital, that should be ensured. With regard to the use of the electronic signature, that Well, that depends on the national legislation that is given in the national provisions overview. And the functionality of this electronic signature should be in accordance with the requirements that are described in the guideline on computerized systems and electronic data in clinical trials that will come out soon. Next slide, please. Then we have the delivery of medicinal products and administration at home. There are different ways of delivering the IMP to the participant's home. It can be from from a depot, and from the pharmacy of the clinical trial site, or from a local pharmacy close to the participant's home. Whatever the way, the basic principles are that highly restricted access to trial participants' contact details are ensured. And the investigator remains responsible for requesting and initiating each shipment of IMP. And very important is also that the investigator and the sponsor should assess whether it's feasible with regard to the storage conditions of the IMP, and also if only restricted access to the IMP at home can be assured. And it should also be considered who can do the administration of the IMP at home. Can the participant do it themselves? Or should clinical health professionals come by and do the administration? And of course, the participant should clearly be instructed on the use and storage of the IMP. And also here in the national provisions overview, specific requirements of the IMP shipment are given. So next slide. I think that's one.
Okay, thank you, Solange. Yeah, then we come at the chapter on clinical trial procedures at home. The focus in this chapter is really on the trial participant home and not on other locations where there could be clinical trial procedures. So at the participant's home, trial procedures could be performed by site personnel, by a third party, or by the trial participant, him or herself. Well, I started saying it, when you're planning your clinical trial, you should already, of course, take care that if you want to perform certain procedures at a trial participant home, that it's feasible to do so. Dus that depends on the procedure you want to perform there. But another aspect with performing trial-related procedures at home is also how is the situation of this trial participant at home? How are the social circumstances? You could imagine that maybe some trial participants want to participate, but they don't like to have a third party coming there, visiting them at home because of certain circumstances. So that is another aspect when you should take into account when you're talking about trial procedures or where you're planning to implement trial procedures at home. When procedures are shifted from the trial site to another place, there is less contact. There could be less contact between the trial participant and the investigator. How does this affect the relationship between them, and how does this affect the compliance of the trial participant with respect to the trial procedures? It's not only administration of the IMP, but other procedures they have to perform. And between brackets, I've mentioned, could there be a role of the general physician? And I have a question mark. I think that is an interesting one to discuss during the breakout session or even later on. So the under consideration we have that we should take into account that there could be a need for on-site visit. Although you have limited on-site visit, there could be a need from the trial participant. That, of course, if there's a safety issue, then it's obvious that there has to be done something, but it could also be another reason. And how is this taken care of? There could also be persons visiting the trial participant home more frequently. The question here is, also could it be a role for the general physician, but also, what do you think about a à la carte choice of the trial participant, whether he or she has always a say whether it should be on site or it can be at the trial participant home? Something to think about it, because if you set the door wide open for this, it could also affect, of course, the methodology, the reliability of the data, because of the variability, which because measurements at home could differ from measurements on site, for instance. And also important that if devices are provided to capture data, there is a strong preference that these devices are provided by the sponsor, and that they don't have to use their own private devices for privacy reasons. Okay, next slide, please. Then we have a chapter on defining and handling of source data. Why is this chapter in? Well, primarily to raise awareness. To raise awareness because in a decentralized clinical trial, the percentage of data collected outside the clinical trial site is much higher than in a traditional trial. And this together with the many different locations where data are being collected, there is also a more complex data flow. So the same principles are applicable regardless of the location of data capture, but you should really ensure that the investigator has control. You as a sponsor, I have to address the right people, of course. The sponsor is responsible to ensure that investigator has control and continuous access to source data, again, irrespective of location of data capture. We made a reference to some Q&A, which are already available. The B3, how and where should source data be defined, but also there is interesting information in the B5 Q&A on the expectation of the investigator's copy of the CRF when using a web-based application. And there has been an opinion from the Scientific Advice Working Party and a notice to sponsor with respect to validation and qualification of computerized systems. It's also an interesting document to study in respect. In addition to this, there are some more specific requirements with respect to sponsors' responsibility when using web-based systems, with respect to privacy, with respect to source data and certified copies, which will be in the paper as well. So thank you. Next slide, please. And well, this is rather an empty slide. It's about trial monitoring, especially remote monitoring. I know that is, if I talk with sponsors or CROs, then this is almost the most frequently asked question if we are talking about decentralized trial. It is not really, of course, a specific decentralized elements, but it pops up all the times when we are talking about decentralized elements in clinical trials. We all know there are recommendations in the paper made up, I think it was 2.5 years ago when we had this COVID pandemic, and there was a need to have a remote source data verification, remote monitoring. But these recommendations are only applicable as long as the COVID pandemic is there. But we think as a project team that there should be general requirements, general recommendations, which are also valid beyond the COVID pandemic. And this is challenging. And what I said, we want to have this paper out by the end of this year. And therefore, this chapter will be more on a high level. as appropriate, and it should be in line with national provision. So we will touch on the topic, but it's a topic which will be addressed in the future as well. So work in progress, and we will manage. Okay, next slide. And the next slide is about, well, thank you for your attention, of course, and for questions and hopefully answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Monique and Solange. I think we have time, 10 minutes at least, for some questions. So the floor is open. Yes. Yes, please.
Apologies, my first time doing this. Hi, I'm Fatima Jami. My question is, you reference home throughout the document. Is it truly the home of the participant or away from the site or a recognized address? I think that's a question that comes to my mind.
Yeah, this chapter focus really only on if trial procedures are being performed at home. We do realize that there could be other locations where trial-related procedures are taking place, apart from the clinical trial site. Well, we had very much discussions on even on the discussion what is a clinical trial site, and we know that towards the future we see things are developing, are changing. The concept of having a clinical trial site with a principal investigator is changing. But we also know that a new ICH EC6 GCP guideline is being developed, where decentralized is of course also touched on the topic. So it's not that we are blinded for this situation, but to have this paper out this year, we have decided to leave that out of the paper, and it's therefore limited to the trial participants' home. So,
can I ask a follow-up question just on that note? And I'm describing it in reference to maybe the pediatric population who are looked after, let's say, by grandparents. So just that clarity around is home.
Home, oh, that's what you mean. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
So then I misunderstand you.
Right.
No, a home is a home. How do you say? I want to say a house is not a home, or a home is not a house. Well, we have made. Well, we are aware that in a pediatric situation that there are could be some slight specific requirements. So that will be touched in the future as well. But there are sometimes in the paper where we refer to, especially for instance with informed consent with pediatric population, we refer that the situation could be different, but we have not made an extensive recommendation on it. But if you say, oh, does it also is applicable for the grandparents' home? Yes, I would say yes.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, maybe a long answer for an easy sorry for that.
Can I just, I will give you the floor, but can I just ask that you give your name, but also the organization you belong to, please? Thanks a lot.
And I'm Thomas from Leo Pharma. Can you hear me? Now? Yeah, okay. My question refers to the third-party vendors. We have been working in our pilot trial to figure out the responsibility split between vendors that is actually supporting the investigator on different support for the patient at home. And it's a little bit unclear to us whether we are allowed to actually contract vendors like nurses or remote physicians who actually in a traditional setting would perform investigator task. So I'm a little bit unclear whether this is addressed in the future recommendation paper, because in the future it will be unlikely that an investigator can contract directly, especially for central units in a multi-center, multinational trial.
Yes, I think I said, but in fact, the sponsor can contract those third parties, but then in the contract between the sponsor and investigator, it should be clearly mentioned that third parties are delegated tasks that are related to the medical care, so that the investigator can agree to that delegation. Is that the answer to your question?
Does that mean the investigator needs to review the contracts before it's signed off?
I don't know.
I think Lisbeth can come in, perhaps. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Lisbeth Weiner from the Danish Medicines Agency. I'm a GCP inspector. And we were just discussing, Gabriele Schwartz and myself, because we are also having this discussion in the ICH E6 revision group, of course, because it is not something that we could not allow. I mean, if it makes sense, it makes sense. But the thing is, it's not sufficient with an agreement. So, of course, there needs to be clear agreement. But I believe also Monique and Solange talked a great deal about, clear communication lines. How is the principal investigator has the possibility to oversee their legal responsibilities, and all that needs to be really clear. So thanks. And we're trying to find a level currently in the E6 guideline. We have a meeting later this week to try to draft this because it's not that simple. So thanks.
Yes, Gabrielle, please.
Yeah, if I may add to this, we had also in the E6 discussion, but it's really an ongoing discussion, and it's as challenging for this international group as well as for us today, so for all stakeholders, to delineate between what is clinical trial related medical care, what's routine care. Therefore, also the discussion that when does a remote physician service, let's say, but that was specific your question, when does this remote physician belongs on the delegation list of an investigator side, so be really working under the responsibility of an investigator, of the investigator and his or her oversight, and when is it really just routine care, so outside any delegation list? And also the question, when does we need a contractual agreement with a healthcare professional in the context of a clinical trial, and what can be really defined as routine care delivered anyway. So this is very much depending on details. It's very difficult to describe it in a crisp, short, with few short sentences, and we are struggling with this in the E6 as well. Therefore, we decided now last week to set up a group and to work on this, and hopefully we come up with something which is meaningful, crisp, but meaningful at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Yes, please.
Yes. Christian Gisselbrecht, Hôpital Saint-Louis. Sorry, I am a clinical investigator for many years and working in oncology and hematology. I am also a member of SAG Oncology, and I was wondering, with all the type of new treatment that we have with maintenance, what type of agreement, convention we will make with the different clinics or hospitals. And that can be a lot, especially in rare disease. So when you say that you don't want to repeat the same procedure among the different places, at the same time, we can be clear that it will increase the burden of the trial. So investigator will be more reluctant to participate, maybe the patient, but if they have to get some rituximab once every 3 months, for example, they have to do it almost in the hospital, and we don't want to have this patient in a university hospital for 2 years. So that's something that we have to be conscious. I understand that it will be on the responsibility of the national legislation, but we have to put pressure to clarify this point. Otherwise, the investigator and the patient will spend their time signing paper just to say, okay, I want to do that, I accept that.
Thank you.
Point
Yes, please.
taken.
Yes, André Alving, I'm a member of the Scientific Advice Working Party, and I see a lot of proposals in this context. But I have a simple question about the scope of the recommendation. Is it completely, do you foresee completely 100% remote trial, or is it a hybrid? It's not fully clear to me.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, in theory, and it depends, of course, on the clinical trial. So it's not a general statement, but in theory, you could imagine that if it is feasible to include all those decentralized elements which has been discussed here, that you could say, well, we have a full DCT. That's a possibility. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. It is counting up the elements and then you come up with a full DCT. But again, I think it's very trial specific, and we chose for a risk-based approach. So I think it will not be feasible for all trials. Yeah, is that answering your question?
Yes, clear. That's more clear to me.
Okay.
Than what I have read.
Than what you have read. Okay. What? Oh, on the slides. Okay. Well. It's okay. Yeah.
I will give you the floor. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. Rebecca Stanbrook from Novartis today, representing Transcelerate. Thanks very much for the presentation and the opportunity to talk about these aspects of DCTs today. Can we perhaps just go back to the last slide, because I was very interested about monitoring, because I think you talked about remote monitoring. And I was just thinking that actually we might want to be talking about monitoring broader rather than just remote, because obviously there'll be some aspects where we've got lots of data. Centralized monitoring might be appropriate to find potential issues, but also there could be some aspects of on-site monitoring. So I was thinking about monitoring in a broader phase.
May I respond to that? Ooh, you have noticed a little mistake in my presentation, because the chapter is on trial monitoring. And when I looked at it last night, I said, oops, I have remote monitoring. That was when I was writing, my mind was on remote, but you're absolutely right. It's on trial monitoring, and centralized monitoring is part of it. So you're right. So it's not only remote, just to be assured. Yeah, okay. Okay. My apology for this slight mistake. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Monique. Yes, please.
Willem Verwij, Dutch Health Inspector. I would like to come back to the remark just before this question. It's not going to be a challenge who does the full, complete remote trial first. I mean, it's not about feasibility for me, it's about necessity. If there are conditions that we need decentralized elements, and they are possible, and they are allowed, and there's an argument for it, of course we go for that. But it's not for me to see who can do the first complete remote trial and say, wow, we did it. That for me is also not in the scope of this document. It's about looking what's necessary, how to have the trials available to participants. I don't read any financial aspect. Let's see how we can cut on costs. Of course, some people read it, I don't. But that should be our driving force, I would say. At least that's what we see it from GCP Inspector's view.
May I comment? Okay, thanks. Well, thank you, Willem. But I think we addressed this in the paper as well. And if that was the interpretation of the answer, then that's not what I'm trying to say. I think there are situations that you really have given a rationale. And what I've said by, sorry, I don't know your name anymore, there are aspects from the investigator viewpoint which you should take into account. So it's not a carte blanche. Then when I say, oh, if you count them up, you can do a full DCT. That's not the case, of course. So just to be clear on that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. Yes, please. We have time for two last questions. So
I'll be brief.
Yeah.
Fatima Jami from AstraZeneca, representing Research Quality Assurance. So I recognise that the recommendations will be evolving, but the question that comes to my mind is around the study documentation. For example, the investigator site file and pharmacy files. Is there any appetite to include how these, because with the expansion of the roles and accountabilities, how that impacts where we will be documenting or maintaining study documentation? Because surely in the DCT environment, this may not be as easy as it would have been if it was on site.
Gabriella?
Yeah, if you allow, I can answer that question. On one of the first slides, it was stated the same principles apply as to any other trial. So it's really up to the sponsor, together with CRO, if a CRO is involved, to define how to maintain the documentation as needed. So to define, and that's also now very clearly stated in the draft ICH E6 we are working on. There is not one size fits all approach to trial master files. So it's more an upfront design. Where will relevant documentation appear? Who is responsible to maintain? During management, very often we see different locations, different storages for parts of the documentation of trial master file, but all this needs to be defined, clear what belongs to a trial master file, again, during management of a clinical trial. And maybe then after the end of the clinical trial, all relevant information is put into one place for long-term maintenance and storage. But this is really part of a clinical trial design. If you go out and include decentralized elements, this is something you have to think through upfront. Does this answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you.
You, Gabriella, I will give the floor, I'm sorry, to the gentleman there in the back, and then we will have to wrap up. But other questions can, of course, be asked during the day. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Erik Klaver from IQVIA. I have a short follow-up question on the question from the gentleman from Leo Pharma, and my own question I had before that. The follow-up question was on the agreements between sponsor and investigators on third parties. Do you foresee that needs to be a contract, or is documentation and delegation of authority on agreement on what tasks are done on behalf of investigator also a suitable way of documenting transfer of responsibility, or at least having that responsibility documented in an agreement way? That the follow-up. The other short question was on the remote monitoring part. It was mentioned that the guidance of the COVID-19 at some point will end. When COVID-19 ends, do you foresee an official moment when it's stated these leniencies are now over? Or is there a natural moment when visits to hospitals are possible and therefore the guidance is not applicable at this time? How do you feel we should be dealing with that? Thank you.
Thank you. For the first question, we go to Lisbeth.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in the E6 group, we are talking more about agreements, but that encompasses contracts. So for us, it's more about the responsible parties, so the sponsor and investigator, to be able to have these responsibilities. So if you need a contract for that, you'll need a contract. If agreements are sufficient, that's sufficient as well. In terms of delegations, usually our position is, I mean, an investigator can delegate to person under his or her area, but cannot just delegate something to people outside an organization. For that, we will need more solid kind of agreements in any terms or forms. But E6 will primarily talk about agreements. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisbeth. For the question on the COVID-19 guidance, Peter can come in.
So maybe I'll put my hat on as EMA steering group on the COVID pandemic management. Lots of really important documents have been put in place to facilitate clinical research, but also medicines regulation in the context of COVID-19. We're in an unprecedented situation, and the exit from that will need to be carefully managed. So I'm not going to give a direct answer to your question, but I would imagine that we need to be firstly learn from the experience over the last couple of years, and actually that's central to what we're doing today. Actually, my sense is that COVID-19 is acting as a catalyst for decentralized clinical trials, and that's a good thing. So I would not imagine a cliff edge, but when that guidance was put out there, it was very clearly in the context of a declared pandemic, and we'll therefore need to manage the communications around which elements, if any, might then be taken forward into more routine practice. So I think it's a really good question, and maybe we can put it on our list of things to actively manage over the next, well, hopefully months, hopefully. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I think then we can go to the next chapter, to say so, on our program, and to start with the point of view of sponsors and CRO perspectives. Peter?
So I have the pleasure of chairing this section. Just to remind ourselves that today is all about listening to stakeholders on decentralized clinical trials. There's always an element, and I've been in this situation many times as a regulator, of feeling we have to have all the answers. So I think I just say to all of the regulators in the room, we don't have to have all the answers. If we don't have the answer, we need to acknowledge the point being made, and then it can go to the working group to further consider whether it goes into the reflection paper to be released this year, or even to be put on the long list for things for the living document that Monique and Dieter and Solange referred to for next year and the years beyond. I say that to make people feel safe, if you like, because we don't have to have all the answers. On that note, let's hear what the sponsors and CROs have got to say. We're going to hear various different perspectives that will take us up to coffee. There will be a coffee break at about 11:20. But our first speaker is Alison Bond. Alison is Director, Global Regulatory and R&D Policy at Amgen, and importantly, she's co-chair of the FPIA Decentralized Clinical Trial team, and today she's representing FPIA and industry. So, Alison, I can't see you. Where are you, Alison? Welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm very excited to be here today, representing FPIA, to talk about the industry sponsor perspective. First of all, to give a bit more insight into the opportunities that we've already touched on, talk a bit about the challenges, what we're doing to overcome those at the moment, but also importantly, what we see as perhaps still needed to really advance the use of DCT elements in clinical trials. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the key opportunity of the decentralized clinical trial model is bringing the trial to the participant. So that provides options, it can reduce burden and facilitate participation. So in the traditional trial model, wherever the participant is located, they generally have to travel to the site for visits, for assessments. And this can mean a lot of travel for many participants to a specialist centre. For example, if they live in remote areas or particularly for rare diseases where there may not be so many centres. So it means that it can serve underrepresented populations. So the trial for the traditional model, they have to go to the site, but for the decentralised model, it really the trial is organised around the participant. So some of all of the assessments are undertaken local to the participant, so they don't need to travel to the site. So it means there's more opportunity for those underserved participants. So if we go on to the next slide. So as we've already touched on, the key thing is that the DCT elements that are used are selected dependent on the trial design, the participant population. So to really use those that are going to bring advantage to the clinical trial. So examples of DCT elements we're talking about, we've already touched on some of them, but telemedicine, mobile healthcare providers such as home nurses, and local healthcare providers such as the patient going to see their own GP, which really, as we say, brings the trial to the participant. And it means they can also fit in the clinical trial around their daily lives, so around work or home, not having to go to the trial centre at set times. We've also touched on things like electronic informed consent, which can provide opportunities in terms of the information provided to the participant using multimedia components, but also facilitating remote consent if needed. And then digital health technologies, which provide opportunities such as wearables and apps to give novel measures, but that can also be done remotely. So if we go on to the next slide. So used in the right way, these DCT elements can provide opportunities to further enhance research. So as we already touched on, removing the geographical barriers to participation, which means that any participant could join a trial, even if they're not located near a site. The potential to increase the diversity of trial participants, so with removing geographical and socio-economic barriers, reducing burden on the participants and caregivers so that they can organise a trial around their daily lives, and empowering the patients with choice for what fits in with them. And as already mentioned, using digital health technologies, it can also facilitate innovative and more meaningful data collection. So the data is collected more on an ongoing basis rather than just at certain times when they go into the site. And this can also allow novel endpoints. So endpoints measured by different means like apps or wearables that perhaps we haven't measured previously, but can also be done remotely and so fitting in with the patient's daily lives. So if we go on to the next slide. So just to touch a bit on some of the challenges, we've already talked a bit about them, but just to take a look at those and group them. So firstly, with regards to operational and technology, as we've said, there's potentially a lot more data, so there's complexity of data flows, and potential for selection bias, looking at the impact on existing operations and how technology is put into the running of the trial. Another key aspect, again, that's already been mentioned, is the relationship and oversight. So really important to look at that relationship between the sponsor and the investigator, but key also the participant and the investigator. So how does the investigator maintain oversight of the trial? How do they maintain oversight of the distributed healthcare team as well that may be used? And important to look at site training, site acceptance, and how the site can use DCT elements. So data privacy and data protection is also a key aspect, and as we said, may not be touched too much in this workshop, but important to note, particularly when you're looking at things like having participants' names and addresses in order to send the IMP directly to patients, electronic signatures that might be used with e-consent, and how that's managed. Data quality, also really important to look at comparability of data for the remote measurements versus the site measurements, and data acceptability and how we manage large data sets, and also perhaps optionality if some patients don't have on-site visits and measurements compared to the remote visits. Sorry, remote measurements. The regulatory framework is also really important. There is a lack of regulatory guidance globally. We're seeing more come out. Some countries such as Denmark, Sweden are issuing guidance, but there is a bit of a lack. And there's also fragmentation. So within Europe, as we've touched on, there's different requirements in different member states. And this can lead to challenges with having to adapt requirements according to local laws and regulations. So just adding another complexity to the setup of trials using decentralized elements. But obviously the key thing here is how do we manage these and really preserve the participant safety and rights and the integrity of the trial results. So if we go on to the next slide, and this is just some of the things that we're doing currently to overcome those challenges. On the next slide, please. So as we've already talked about, DCT elements should be used to fit in with the participant population, the investigational product, the trial design, and the country it's being run in. And as we've already mentioned, the situation, like during the pandemic, obviously, there was a need to really consider DCT elements at that time. It's important to make sure they're used in the right way and as needed, and not just for the sake of it. We are working together with cross-industry associations, initiatives and other multi-stakeholder initiatives to have a shared understanding. So, for example, with Trancelerate, IMI, Trials at Home, and I know we'll hear more about that today. And it's important to really collaborate and share expertise and see how we can work together to move forward. as we've already mentioned as well, key to engage patients, advocates and healthcare professionals in trial design, including the use of DCT elements, and make sure that they do work for all concerned. And again, moving towards continuing with that aim of protecting participants' rights and well-being, as well as reliable trial results. So just to end on what we think could be done, if we go on to the next slide, or what is needed to advance further the use of DCT elements. So in the EU, a clear understanding of the differences between member states and a harmonised and transparent approach for the use of DCT elements. And of course, this is one thing that we're really hoping should come out of the EU DCT project, the recommendations and the provisions that are coming with that. Globally, ICHE 6R3 should support use of DCT elements, and I know that is being looked at with the revision with R3, and hopefully will provide a degree of harmonisation globally. One thing that we consider is needed is agreement on where the CTA DCT elements should be listed and justified, described and justified, to make sure that it doesn't put too much difficulty if they're in too much detail in the protocol, and then gives difficulty with amendments needed when you have different country variations. And then also looking at the data. And one of the key things is making sure that the data from these trials that use DCT elements are acceptable. And so perhaps some recommendations and information around statistical approaches for the data for clinical trials using DCT elements. So if we go on to the next slide. And this was just to really, we were discussing where we see the future of decentralized clinical trials. And if you go on to the next slide, then what we would say is we kind of see the future of decentralized trials as just being referred to as clinical trials. So we might not have a situation where we talk about decentralized clinical trials, hybrid clinical trials, or traditional clinical trials, but rather DCT elements become part of the clinical trial toolbox. And so when you're setting up a clinical trial, you look at what makes sense for that trial, that design, that participant population, and then use whatever elements fit with that. So it may be a full decentralized trial, or it may just have elements, but really using what's most appropriate to give the maximum benefit. And so if we go on to the next slide, it's really just to say thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak today, and really looking forward to a great workshop to move forward in this space. Thank you.
Alison, thanks very much for a very clear presentation. And I like your concluding slide. You know, this is not a binary thing, and the world is actually about adapting our clinical trial design to the optimal situation for patient access and for delivering a high quality and impactful clinical trial. Having heard the industry sponsor perspective, let's hear the academic sponsor perspective. Pleasure to introduce Vasilis Golfinopoulos, who is the EORTC, so the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, headquarters director. And very, very pleased to give you the floor. I can't see you, sir. There you are. There you are, right next door.
Good morning, everybody, in presence and remote. So indeed, I will present the experience of EORTC during the COVID-19 pandemic. And before starting, I need to make clear the scope of EORTC in the presentation. So we are an academic sponsor doing clinical trials on treatment of cancer. Okay, so we're talking in a scope where all our subjects for whom I will talk about are cancer patients under active treatment. Second, everything that I will present as our experience on decentralized elements in clinical trials came in these trials on demand. It was not planned from the beginning of the clinical trials. The demand came from patients, sites, investigators to put something in place. Third, all this demand that we had to satisfy was there to support patient investigators, mostly already part of a clinical trial and under active treatment or follow-up. The patient accrual was reduced significantly during the first months of the pandemic. You will remember that cancer clinical trials were not the focus. And when I say significantly, we kept 1/5 of the accrual for the first 3 months before slowly going up to recover. So most of these slides are part of internal lessons learned presentation happened after the pandemic, and I'm very happy to share a little bit the details of how we responded to it. So one funny thing we realized that to decentralize, you need to centralize, because every decentralized activity needs to have a centralized counterpart, needs to be monitored somewhere, needs to be triggered and followed up. And specifically for COVID-19, we have to make an early assessment for every case, every country, every site. Sometimes I say country, sometimes I say member state. We do not only do trials in European Union countries. So sometimes it's Switzerland, for example, or even outside geographical Europe. And then we had to communicate what was possible as decentralized elements in clinical trials before they could ask for it. Okay, it was not a situation where they were asked and we try to find out what is possible and what is not. So starting with the different elements that could be put in place. Next slide, please. Remote informed consent was done for specific cases without the use of any electronic setup. So it was not an electronic remote signature that would be equivalent to a wet signature. Initial consent remained on site. Countries did not allow it, hospitals did not allow it, and frankly, consenting a patient for starting a cancer treatment remotely is not something that most would request. So the visit would be there anyway. Face-to-face is important in these situations. So we did not even have the demand for it. We did not have the request. But reconsent, especially for changing processes related to decentralized elements in COVID clinical trials, actually happened. And the guidance was to do it by phone or video discussion, followed by written email confirmation. No wet signature. Sometimes sites requested wet signature whenever the patient reached the site eventually. Next slide, please. Regarding exams, there was an order of preference. We tried to keep everything on site because additional labs would also need to be contracted. So there was administration needed that beyond the cost would also introduce delay, and that might not allow the patient to actually do the trial, the exam on time. Now, if you go through the list of the order of preference for the imaging procedures, you see, at least I think, that sticking to the timeline specified to the protocol to make sure that the integrity of results is there above all, takes preference of having the patient on site on the imaging lab that was originally specified. So if you see lines, the second and the third line, off-site on time was preferred to on-site and delayed. And I assume that this is one of the main reasons that we want to promote decentralized elements in clinical trials. If you can do it better, if you can do it on time, instead of going to the site, hey, it's kind of obvious. So patient visits could be changed to phone visits. All these were follow-up visits. Whether they needed to do standard assessments, let's say before chemotherapy, they could do it remotely, but we need to know the laboratory, we need to contract the laboratory. We are not exempt for the requirement to collect the normal ranges, for example. So we have to go through that. And then we will need to have agreed on the deviation, prepare the deviation, and document the deviation. Now, one of the most prominent elements of decentralized clinical trials was delivery on patient's home. Only for oral formulations, evidently, there was no setup for intravenous or parenteral administration at home. The shipment took place by the vendor already contracted to ship the drugs to the hospital. The same vendor delivered the drugs to the patient's home. So it was not the site that arranged for the move. There was a guideline addendum. There was acknowledgement from the patient. There was no pharmacist to acknowledge that the drugs were delivered on good condition. So we had to make the patient do part of the job, and they were doing it. And again, I repeat there what happened with the central laboratories. So next slide. An important consideration. We needed their consent, not necessarily written consent, because remote delivery of drugs introduces an additional element. It's not obvious to patients that only had to do with the clinical trial site that another party, contracted of course within the scope of the clinical trial, but still another party will know their name, address, phone number, trial they are in, and drugs they are taking. So they absolutely needed to be explicit in their consent of such setup. Next slide, it was okay. Thank you. So this is what the guidance we gave our staff. The bullet points do not have to happen in this order. So first we need to have, the first bullet needs to happen first. We need to know that this is possible in that site and country according to the regulatory setup. But then we need to know the additional cost, which was not a factor to allow it or not. We absorbed it. We need the medical monitor to be aware, and we needed the clinical research associate to be aware, because eventually when they were going on site, they needed to know what they will find there. Note to the trial master file for all of these elements. Now, to give you a scope of the numbers in bold, for the past 2 years, our average accrual was about 3,000 patients a year. So all the decentralized elements I'm talking about have until 52 patients in all this accrual. Okay. Next slide, please. So I will, in 3 slides, I will show exactly what happened in one big member state. I don't hide it on purpose, it's not a secret, but it doesn't matter. It's just an example to show how even more practically how this happened. So there was, in that country, there was a request for an urgent safety measure to avoid delay for every remote process that happened and every patient. So it was not one cumulative for all. Previous slide, please. And then followed by submission of a substantial amendment to describe everything as we should have described. The protocol did not need to be amended itself, but an amending was necessary. Next slide, please. The country was incredibly helpful. Pharmacies remained open. They were involved in the request for shipment of IMP to patients' home, and they tried to facilitate remote visits, although this did not happen in this case. And third and last slide, next slide, please. On-site monitoring. Everything happened by phone. Everything was we tried to follow up everything by phone. Source data verification was not possible. It was not allowed. It was kind of difficult showing on the screen. A detail that may matter for academic sponsors, we heard also that the cost is a consideration. Sites notified us from other countries that if we wanted to do remote source data verification, we need to reimburse, we need to pay for the extra time of the site staff that they will have to spend face-to-face on video showing documents. So this increased the cost a bit in an unforeseen way. Previous slide, please. I think I have one line. Yes, that was also possible. It doesn't matter very much. So my concluding slide, next slide, please. Decentralized processes are possible, can happen even in an emergency with a lot of work, but necessarily come on top of the centralized in-hospital processes that are already happening. We do not see, especially in oncology, situations where the patients have to be remote for extended period of time, not visit the hospital. The need is not there anyway. We could imagine clinical scenarios where some processes could be decentralized only, but for oncology at this time, I would imagine them as a clinical research endeavor that had endpoints related to the remote processes themselves. For example, something obvious, I can think of For patient-reported outcomes, it's not obvious to me that the patient in a waiting room having to fill a questionnaire there and then would have the same answers as the same patient sitting in the comfort of their own home at the moment of their choice, completing the questionnaire with a different environment. So this is a nice research question, and maybe we need to start tackling it before we just move to a remote procedure, assuming that's the same as a centralized process. So thank you very much.
Very nice presentation. It's very nice to hear the story. We've lived in a very complex world over the last 2 years where everything has been reinvented, and looking at how you did it in a particular scenario and with an example of one member state is very nice. My sense is that some of the learnings from COVID will be applicable long term, others will not. I mean, I would imagine, and this is just an instinctive comment, that vast amounts of variability and changing during a clinical trial based on changing measures for restricting patient access to the healthcare measures is extremely disruptive in terms of looking after the patient, but also collecting robust data. And one would imagine that one wouldn't want to try and transpose that over to a post-pandemic time. But a really interesting story. So thank you for sharing that with us. Let's move on then to our last presentation, which is from a CRO insight. Pleasure to introduce Ioanna Matsakis, who's a member of the executive board of UCROFT, also treasurer and chairman of the GDPR task force of UCROFT. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to contribute to this very important work. Maybe my first slide, please. Yeah, we are going to share this session with Fiona Maney from ACRO. Please, next slide. Yeah, one first introductory comment I would say is that what we see when preparing this presentation, what we witness, there are studies that show that for the last 20 years, there has been a continuous introduction of new innovative elements in clinical trials. There is a study that states that the average introduction of DCT elements or innovative elements was 23% per year. So it's not new. It's not new, and of course, when we are now, but it has taken up with the COVID pandemic. When looking at the things we have to think about and how we can go further, we were basing our brainstorming on 3 pillars: patient safety, patient protection, and we see that patient protection, patient safety, they share some common elements regarding cybersecurity, and we have very regularly at the moment in the newspapers incidents related to cybersecurity. And the quality of data that has been mentioned many times, and I'm quite reassured to see that everybody is more or less aligned on those subjects, and I've seen from all the previous presentations, including the recommendations, that there is a lot in these directions. Next slide, please. So we were trying to pick up a few of the elements that we are facing on a daily routine. So, for instance, if you take the e-consent, consent has been mentioned a number of times. The first thing that the CRO is going to be asked for is e-consent applicable in that country, in that region? Of course, this applies to other DCT elements. So all what could be done to address this point, and I've seen that when we speak of regulatory harmonization, we first acknowledge that there is no full harmonization. There is a part of it, but not all of it. And that's really the kind of things we would like to have practical tools to answer. That's daily life for CROs, and of course for smaller CROs. Just worth to mention that UCROFT, from the 450 affiliates, many of them are small companies, but acting in different countries. There are some of them innovative companies producing new systems, and therefore they have to be able to answer to those questions in a transparent way and a common way. That's very important. So I'm keen to see how this work, which is being done by the task force, is going to be published, so it becomes a common property. Next slide, please. The second thing we are facing when implementing a trial is the variability between the situations, specifically with the sites. So, and we see that introducing new tools, whatever they are impacting the way you are going to perform the study. So there is the way in the emergency where you are going to put a lot of manpower to mitigate the situation and try to find a solution because you have to, whatever the tool you are going to use. But if you want to switch to regular, to routine work, then you need to change the common way of doing, the processes, the way you are doing. And so what we witness from the practical point of view is that we are implementing a lot of pilot activities with sites and sponsors all together so that this change be managed in the proper way. And as I understood from the recommendation paper, it is something that is going to evolve. How can we accompany that continuously based on those experiences? And we see that depending on the size, depending on the pathology, we may have very different experiences. Slide 3, please. Data protection. Data protection has with the GDPR, it has been felt in a number of situations as an inhibitor to innovation. We believe it is exactly the contrary. It is an innovative regulation that provides the opportunity to co-build the regulation through the codes of conduct approach, which is embedded in the regulation itself, and there is a cooperation mechanism that obliges the data protection authorities of the 27 EU member states to harmonize their positions. So it is a virtuous thing, and it defines concepts that, for instance, I have heard many times here in this room today, how the responsibilities are split. How do you delegate a task or not delegate a task? Those things are already there've been a theory about that, and I think that it would be worth, maybe not now, but in the next releases, once more experience has been collected, that at least those approaches such as codes of conduct and any other approaches, there is a certification mechanism also under Article 42, that those things be taken on board of the recommendation paper because it's going to help the various stakeholders. Next slide, please. We have other topics that have been already mentioned. I will not go into the details. We are indeed facing the issue of hybrid situations where you have to cope, not only because of this time of different regulations in the different countries, but because of the patient himself. He may want to change his position, and indeed how the data can be collected all together and produce meaningful results and outcomes. We share the view that has been already expressed by the other participants today that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. We don't have the solution yet for that. And the same for responsibility and role, we've already mentioned that. And that's it for me. Next slide, maybe. Just to say, yes, it's. I mentioned earlier that it is not 100% new. Yes, it's an ongoing work at UCROF through the different working groups. These are some of the documentation and papers that have been produced, and you can refer to if needed for further information. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I introduce our next speaker, again from sponsor and CRO perspective, Fiona Maney. Fiona is chair of the ACRO Decentralised Clinical Trial Working Party and is a Senior Director in Global Compliance and Strategy with Meditator at Dassault Systems. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everyone here and on the phone. So obviously ACRO is the Association of Clinical Research Organisations, including the largest CROs and technology companies. And I'm chair of their DCT Working Party that we set up in 2019. And really the remit of the group was to kind of do some landscape scanning for us to identify and address barriers to adoption of DCTs. So I'm going to really briefly talk about, I guess, some of those activities of the DCT Working Party over those 3 years. So next slide, thank you very much. It's probably difficult to see, but there are some extra slides at the back of the pack for more details. But anyway, from, I guess, today we have 5 documents published, and I'll go through each one of those, and we're just about to publish another one on various topics. So essentially the remit of the group was to, I guess, look at how to advance DCTs and make some of the thinking and kind of all of the documents available We've had, over the period of time, we've had engagement and informal listening sessions with a lot of different stakeholders. So it's not just been our CRO stroke technology company thinking, but it's actually, we've infused it by having interviews and engagement with a lot of stakeholders across industry, sites, regulatory authorities, ethics, and patients. So the first document we created was basically looking, well, we call it the QBD manual for DCTs, so the quality by design manual for DCTs. And really what we started to do was we pulled together the end-to-end process, right from early engagement with stakeholders, study design, through conduct, etc., and close out and archiving. So we took that whole kind of, we have a tube map which represents that. And we've gone through every single stop, and it took us probably about, over a period about 6 to 8 months to come up with I guess, a view across each of the processes. So we're really looking at, okay, look at the traditional model and what does a DCT change? And so we mapped that out. And so really the QBD manual is a comprehensive quality-based framework dedicated to clinical trials from early design and planning to close out and archiving. And we did leverage the City quality by design framework to a degree as well. So we also looked at definitions, process, technology, the regulatory landscape, data protection, data privacy, etc., and also clearly the use of electronic systems. We did take this document around and get feedback from authorities and other stakeholders, and then the next, so that is available on the website. The next document that we, or based on the fact that we did the quality by design manual, we obviously had a consolidation of risks that we'd also kind of, as a part of those discussions, talked about. So the next document that was published is the DCT risk assessment, which we actually leveraged the Transcelerate risk assessment categorization tool. So this takes from an end-to-end process. I guess it asks some of those questions. It's really a template to systematically raise questions that facilitate cross-functional discussion and to also identify and mitigate potential risks in decentralizing clinical trials. So obviously, as we've spoken about today, each trial will be different and may have a different risk profile. So really it gives a consolidation of some of the risk areas per process. The next document at the top on the end is a white paper. So this really summarized what we did and the methodology we took, but it also has a lot of case studies. So you can always learn a lot from what others have done in the industry already. So it's got a lot of case studies in there, and also it's got feedback. We consolidated some of the feedback from some of the authorities and some of the other stakeholders in that document as well. So it's more of a quick read and a high-level overview of what we've done and some real-life case studies. Then the next document that was published last year was really a consolidation of the QBD. So we'd had some comments back that if we maybe condensed our QBD manual, because it's actually at 40 pages, if we condensed it down, it could be a lot of use to help with training, etc. So we have a QBD quick reference guide, which really summarizes very eloquently and concisely, I guess, the critical factors and points. And also last year we published our DCT data flow maps, and this was on the back of the fact that we'd heard from stakeholders at the GCP symposium regarding the complexity of data flow. And this is what they exactly said. So sponsors CRO need a detailed understanding of the data flow with a data flow diagram that includes from whom and to whom the data are transferred or transmitted, including all third-party vendors contracted for data collection, data handling, data management, and data processing. So that's a quote. So what we did then was we basically looked at the different components and how data flows between the processes and the technologies. And we came up with kind of 11 components, which we decided to really focus in on 5, which I think Joanne was also talking on the same 5 or 6 components earlier. So we've got data flow diagrams that, for example, for electronic informed consent, direct to patient supply, investigator participant interactions and home health visits and connected devices. So at a very high level, it shows how data flows generically through these processes. So these are all available today on the ACRO website. What we've been working on in the last 6 months, which is hopefully going to be published imminently, is navigating a DCT transformational change. So all about change management. So we were looking at, okay, how do you go from one model to another across patient caregivers, sites, ethics committees, regulatory authorities and industries. And the questions that we were asking were, what's the attitude and interest to change? What are the current levels of support? What are concerns and fears, risks, barriers, and benefits? And what happens if we don't change? And what are the points of resistance to change? So through, I guess, some of the thinking that the team members did, and also the interviewing with the different stakeholders, we've kind of consolidated that thinking all together. So that hopefully should be published very soon. But as I say, that's all available if you would like to reference these documents, and just creating awareness that these are out there and have been gone through a lot of thinking. Anyway, that's all from me. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much indeed. So listen, I take from the two sides of the presentation.
Sorry, no, I did have one more slide. Apologies, sorry.
Go on, go with the crescendo. Go with the crescendo.
Sorry about that. I was just getting carried away there. But anyway, I think just in summarising also what we've seen. There's a lot of information out there, and it's probably information overload, really. But I do think we are all sharing very common, similar thoughts. And obviously, these resources are available, and hopefully will help inform, I guess, the EU DCT recommendations paper. What we recognise is the variability across member states. For example, if you look at e-consent, yes. Member states may be happy for educating and informing patients using a multimedia tool, but it's that kind of signature piece that is variable. Sometimes it needs a qualified signature, sometimes advanced might be okay, or sometimes there's actually at the moment no opinion. So, and I think for other areas as well, I think there is a variability, or just maybe a lack of knowledge and whatever. So what we might suggest is it would be nice, and I think this might be coming, if there is some kind of matrix or repository per component and per kind of member state. Is it allowed, or yes or no? And if no, or if yes, then the reference to the national legislation, I think, would be very, very useful, I think, to us, because then you can see immediately where things are allowed, etc. And I also, we touch on the fact that, it's not just GCP, but it's GDPR, it's IEDAS now with another telecommunications kind of rules. And it's almost like, do we need to have greater collaboration if we're not already with some of those authorities that are responsible for those other regulations? Just some thoughts from the team. So now I'm done, Peter.
No problem at all. So listen, I take from that direction must be harmonisation at European level, but the idea of that was presented by Monique of having an annex which gave transparency to national rules sounds complementary, and it seems to be endorsed by the CRO speakers. Data protection as an enabler rather than as a barrier. I think there's still lots more work to do and on the implementation to actually use it as an enabler. I think the subtext of Fiona's presentation was to the regulators. We've done a lot of work. Have a look at it before you finalise your your recommendations paper. I think that's what she was really saying. And listen, Fiona, Ioanni, I think we love quality by design. So thank you for emphasizing that. Listen, we've got maybe 6 or 7 minutes for questions and answers, or just for making your views heard. Today is all about listening and hearing views. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have all the answers. So would anybody, either from another CRO representative or anybody else in the room, having heard those presentations, or from the academic side, or from the industry sponsor side, wish to make an intervention? Please, right at the back. Lady right at the back. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Myriam Estrabo.
Bring the microphone closer to your...
I'm Myriam Estrabo. I'm the head of clinical trial platform in Institut Claudius Regaud, Toulouse in France. I have a question for Vasilis regarding his experience in DCT trials. You said during the presentation, you explained that the oral IMP was sent to patients' home using a sponsor vendor, and that delivery was ordered by a site. So I was wondering from where was coming the study drug. Was it from a depot? And in that case, was it the patient who checked that the treatment received was the good one, good dosage? Did you relabel the box? And how did you trace the information?
Yes, good question. Yes, it was a patient who was accountable to check. Usually, from what we know, the investigator set up a phone call with the patients to actually discuss what they have received and what they should do with that. We had one case where the drug was delivered to the pharmacy and then taken again by the transport company to be sent to the patient's home. So the same transport company. In no case that we know the site itself organized shipment without the involvement of the original shipping company.
Yeah, but the IMP was coming from the site pharmacy stock or from your depot?
It's complex because you're an academic sponsor. So the IMP was always coming from the pharmacy because it needed to be labeled. But we also delivered drugs that were not IMPs in some of our studies, and these could go directly.
I suggest you carry this one in the corridor in the coffee break, because it sounds like you've got lots of experience and people are interested in the detail. So maybe we just close that one. There was the gentleman. Yes, please, right in front of you.
Thomas Leofama. I think just a comment on the future recommendation paper. I think we have touched upon the very critical elements, but I think we still are in a phase where we have a lot of traditional thinking in our heads. And what we don't talk so much about is really the design and the capability of the technology. Because one thing is that the technology exists in other sectors, and each sponsor and team are trying to sort of merge this together into some kind of solution that would work for investigators and patients, but they're not designed for these roles. And what our experience is that we are a long way from obtaining that scenario where you can just bring your own device, you have an easy access and overview of all the incoming data, both the investigator and the sponsor. We are far from that scenario. So I actually think this should be part of the planning and have more focus on from the regulatory framework work before allowing these components to be implemented, because it increases the burden a lot for the patient and for the investigator, especially if there's all these mitigations for people actually looking at lists and portals and different systems, especially if there's a need for a robust clinical oversight and to be able to take the clinical decisions by the investigators. It should not be a burden for them to actually oversee all this data. And we don't have these dashboards or portals yet. So I would actually like to see some some remarks about the design and the ability to maintain oversight, because we just increase complexity. I think that was the gentleman said, it's not new that we bring innovative things into studies, but nobody has really thought about how do we actually puzzle this together in an easy way to actually oversee.
I think we got you, sir. Maybe I ask Dieter to intervene. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Thomas. I think it's a spot-on comment, but I think in the recommendation paper, we are doing what we can from our side. So we are not going to be able to drive the technological development in order to support the platform, but we are drawing up the frames, and we are focusing and saying, so when you are developing technologically platforms, you have to make sure they are fit for purpose, that they are validated for the users at all ends. And that we are also that you have to make sure that oversight is maintained. So I think that that's what we can do from our side. We can draw it up, and it will be clear. But if we go any further, I think we are also maybe gonna set some boundaries we don't want to make. We just want to make the frames, and then we are hoping that that you will solve those technologically challenges, right?
Don't respond, Thomas. Listen, we're on a journey. We're all on this journey together. I understood from Monique and Solange that this is going to be version 1.0 released before Christmas, and it's going to be a living document. I'm going to make a soft promise. So I've got my fingers crossed when I do that. Soft promise that this topic is going to be a very live topic as we formally launch a multi-stakeholder platform. You'll have seen that in the ACT-EU work plan next year. And I've got a feeling we're going to come back, and we're going to be learning together over time. And the recommendations are going to be evolving rapidly. And I think that's a very, very good thing, because my personal view is that access for patients, reducing costs, better clinical trials can all be brought to bear by having decentralized elements in clinical trials. And I think that's why we're all here today. Listen, we have done, I know this, okay, go on, we'll have the last question, but bear in mind there's some coffee waiting for people outside. So I put that as a pressure for you to weigh.
So thank you so much. Halit Kayhan from KU Leuven, so from academia. And I would like to ask you, so at the very beginning, you told that data protection will not be covered in these recommendations, but I totally agree with the fact that this code of conducts, this was from the European Union CRO Federation presentation, code of conducts has a great potential in this decentralized clinical trials. So I suppose this will not be covered in this first version of the recommendations, but if this is not correct, please let us know. And if so, do you think to touch upon the data protection related parts in the, let's say, following versions of these guidelines, or do you have a plan to work on these parts in a separate document? So, or I don't know, maybe whether you think this is out of your work or whatever. So thanks a lot.
Dieter, quick response.
Very quickly, yeah, it won't be in the first version. We thought it was just too early, but if you're telling us that there's some work we can rely on, that's going to be making our job much easier, and we'll take it on in the next version if it's necessary. And that's where we are also looking for picking up on your needs all through days and in the breakouts. And Monique has a comment as well.
Quickly.
Just a small comment, just to say, of course, the GDPR is mentioned in the paper, just to be clear, but the specific requirements is not. And we can't do this without the GDPR Data Protection Board on the EU level. So there are already in a different gremia trying to have some advice from the EU Data Protection Board, but that's a rather long and difficult procedure. So it's complicated, but
Monique, we do long and we do complicated. So let's be ambitious here.
Well, I'm not saying it is a no, but
No.
I'm always in for managing expectations. So that's
okay, so
why
I'm going to
telling.
raise expectations.
Okay.
Go back.
Well, we will see.
Act EU. For the first time in the European Union, we have the heads of the national agencies, we have the European Commission, and we have the European Medicines Agency united and politically supporting an initiative to make clinical trials better in Europe. If data protection is a key issue, and I'm sure it is, that momentum of Act EU should be used to try and make things better, I would say. Now, how much we can do and how quickly we can do it, I don't know. But if you're telling us, and if we start to get consistent feedback that working on codes of conduct, for example, and maybe having a European level code of conduct would be beneficial to delivering high quality, large, fast clinical trials, well, let's explore that space over the next year or two. So go on, have the last word.
Just one comment, a very short comment. I think it's much better to have these recommendations as they are without too much on GDPR now, released now, and having in the next year some upgrade rather than waiting for more and having the GDPR from scratch from the beginning. So I would support 100% personally as you this approach.
So Monica, Solange, and Dieter, you're getting a strong, that's a nice way to end before our coffee break. So those of you who are following remotely, we're going to break now for 15 minutes. We will restart at 20 to 11 Central European time. For those that are on site, coffee, it's a kind of help yourself just outside this room. And please, let's restart on time at 22. Thank you very much indeed. Really interesting session. Great to hear your views. So welcome back, colleagues. Can I ask you to settle down so that we can hear our next speakers? Thanks very much. Taking your seats. So can I welcome back to those who are following remotely? You know, those 15-minute coffee breaks, it's not the first time ever that it's become 20 minutes. You'll have to forgive us, but actually not bad. We're all back in by 1:45 and ready to hear the patient and investigator perspective. And I hand over to Greet, who's going to chair this session. Greet, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone to this second module where we will listen to the voices of the patients and the investigators. So we are very pleased that they are here. We will start with the patient perspective, and I'm happy to introduce Julian Isla. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He's a scientific advisor of the European Dravet Syndrome Federation. He's founder of Foundation 29, a non-profit organization focused on covering unmet medical needs of patients with rare disease using technology, and he's also member of the COMP as patient representative, and I'm very happy that you are here. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you so much for the invitation to this workshop. And next, please. I work for Microsoft, or at least Microsoft is the company who is paying to me. This is my professional work. On top of this, I'm doing multiple things, as Great already mentioned. But I'm a patient advocate because I have a son with a genetic condition called Dravet syndrome. And the disease of my son motivated me to create patient organizations and move into technology. And right now, I'm also the privilege of representing patients at the Orphan Drug Committee at the European Medicines Agency. Next, please. This is my opinions are my own opinions and not the opinions of the agency, my CPM declaration of interest. Next, please. Decentralized. When I received the invitation for decentralized clinical trials, I was thinking about the name. You know, decentralized means I just taken this description or this definition of the word. You know, is used to describe organizations on their activities which are not controlled from one central place. And maybe this is not the case, right? Because the promoter of the industry or developing the drug is the organization who is controlling from a central place. And probably this is called more remote clinical trials, or or virtual clinical trials, or whatever. But decentralization maybe is a different word. But I'm not going to open in the discussion today. Just think about that issue. Next, please. Something that is happening, and this is something that is happening right now, because my expertise is in neurology, is in encephalopathies, is in syndromes with seizures. And if you are checking the EMA clinical investigation, the guideline to conduct medical studies for epilepsy, you will find the primary endpoint are seizures, right? Next, please. Something very interesting with seizures is a data, and it's a medical outcome reported always by the patient, always. When I'm going to my son participated in a couple of clinical studies. The first question from the investigator during the visits to the doctor were, how many seizures your son had? And this is something that we are reporting. The patients are reporting this data. It's something that the physicians, they are not able to get during the visit to the hospital or during the visit to the clinic. It's happening right now. The main endpoint for drugs, anti-seizure medications, is data reported just by the patients. Next, please. As we already discussed this morning, probably decentralization could be an attribute or a toolbox or something that you can use when this is needed. Because depending on the condition, a fully decentralized clinical study, maybe it doesn't make sense, and the other way around, and probably will be in the middle, with something we call hybrid, or something that is more a characteristic, an attribute that a real condition. And always, I guess, the patient should make a choice. The patient, in the ideal world, the patients, they don't want to go to hospitals. We don't want to go to visit, to do travels, to get out of home. It's something we don't really like it, in most of cases. But we should consider the opinion of the patient always and make sure this is respected. Next, please. One problem, I'm talking right now about the issues, is the motivation of the patient. It could happen that because of the decentralization and the need of technology and the need of all the lack of human touch, the patient could be unmotivated. And also there is an issue with the capacity of the patients with the technical skills and also with the age. We need to make sure the clinical trials are inclusive and they are designed for every type of patient and at different age. Next, please. Something we didn't talk this morning is about the physician's technical skills. In my organization, we are working with physicians a lot, and unfortunately, they don't have any training on technical skills, any at all. They are struggling even with Excel or PowerPoint, right? And this is something we have to consider, because if we are going to facilitate technology and tools to physicians, we have to make sure they have the skills to use it. On this study, you will see how the technical skills from the physicians in general are much more lower than expected. Next, please. Distance. Distance in terms when you are running a decentralized clinical study, you can feel this distance from the physician, from the nurses, from the hospital. But we need to make sure this could happen and activate the mitigation actions in order to sort it out. Like, for example, having a hotline where patient can call every time, 24/7. The availability of the nurses and physicians. In the preparation of this meeting, I asked to our physicians, are you giving your phone number to your patients? Most of the physicians, they are not giving the phone number because, and I understand this, because they don't have time. Our physicians don't have time to treat patients properly. That's the reality. And this problem is getting worse and worse because we have less and less physicians. So if we don't start to work on this problem is going to be a huge problem. We have to facilitate the possibility of visiting the patient at home if they want. Why not having an echocardiogram at home if this is possible, you know? They involve the patient in the clinical design. This is super critical, you know. Use the apps you are using are created using user experience, and the design of the tools is co-designed with the patient, because you will have people with a lot of motivation, usually severity drives motivation. The people with more severe conditions will be much more motivated than people with less severe conditions. And always don't forget the human touch creating this application, because digital tools are tools. They are not substitutes of humans. Next, please. I know it's not on the scope of the document on the work we are doing today, but GDPR and data protection is super critical. And I really encourage to the companies, the CROs, everybody doing this type of tools, do a PIA, a privacy impact assessment for everything you do, just to make sure the data of the patient is protected. Right now, when I'm going into Facebook, the Facebook advertisement is advertisement to me antibodies for the condition of my son. They know a lot about me, you know, because I already put that information in Facebook, and it's fine, you know. But we have to make sure who has our information as citizens. It's not about being patients or not. It's about knowing where our information is as citizens. Next, please. And this is the last one. Yeah, my son participated in 2 clinical studies. They were clinical studies, not really clinical trials, clinical studies. I don't have any data, any at all. It doesn't make sense. The data owns to the patient. It will be better that the data collected during the first clinical trial will be used for the second clinical trial, because I have to put the data twice in some digital tool. And the work I did for the first one is lost. And this is a very important topic. I really like the strategy of the UK government. It's a pity they are out of Europe because of the Brexit. But they created a fantastic policy paper. It's called Data Save Lives. And they are sharpening how data has to go to the patient back and make sure the data is the owner of the data, or the patient is the owner of the data, as GDPR says. No more, you know. We have to make sure the GDPR was a good idea, but we have to implement this idea, in particular in specific tools. Next, please. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the work you are doing.
Thank you very much, Julian, for this point of view. We will now go and listen to the point of view of investigator. And I'm very pleased to invite Filippo Pieralli. He's an experienced investigator in multi-center clinical trials in the fields of cardiovascular medicine and infectious diseases. He is head of the intermediate care unit at the University Hospital Careggi in Firenze, and he is director of the Department of Research of the Italian Society of Internal Medicine Physicians. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. Hello, everybody. And my speech will be on the perspective of the investigator about decentralized clinical trial. I don't have any conflict of interest. I am proud of this. And please, with the next slide. And we know that DCT is, we already heard during the morning, that's good. There are good substance for this kind of research. And both patients and clinicians are, I think that DCTs are good for many reasons. This is a survey that was carried out on August 2020, just during the COVID-19 pandemic, and all patients' opinion about DCTs is good because they, especially because they could not waste time reaching the center and for visits. And we can see that almost 2/3 of patients think that they need to travel more than 30 minutes to reach the center. So, and 73% of them are very interested to be reached at home for visits or medicine delivery. And a significant percentage of patients deem very important the following possibilities: the collection of samples at home, availability of apps for monitoring, and delivery of medication again. Next slide, please. Even the clinician opinion is good about clinical trials, and especially thanks to during the COVID-19 pandemic, was already heard by Vasilis. We were very happy that many procedures were more rapid during this period of time, and we think that it was a good experience and a good experiment that needs to be harmonized. And many patients, many clinicians, nearly 80% of clinicians, think that patients waste much time waiting and reaching the for activities not directly related to the study, and they think too that there is a good retention of patients in clinical trials, and even more possibly than traditional clinical trials. But you know, DCT does not fit all, as we already know, and there is a high compliance to procedures. Obviously, it depends from patient to patient and centers from centers. Next slide, please. But decentralized clinical trials are a minimum percentage of the total amount of clinical trials ongoing, at least at 2020. In all over the world, DCTs are at least nearly 0.5%, and in Europe, 0.5% of all clinical trials. A little more in North America, especially referring to neurological or psychiatric disorders. Please, next slide. And here in the next 4 slides, I will present my personal point of view about DCTs. I think they are an involving important step in the field of clinical research, and they, I think, that are particularly useful for patients with rare disease, for whom the referral center can be very distant and not easily reachable by the patient, and even for older patients with limited mobility and functional disability, that have big difficulties to reach the center, to make visits and collecting samples and so on. Next slide, please. And when dialing, sorry for the typo, with DCTs, technology is a key point. We heard this morning, and I think too that during the design of the trial, technology is not an accessory, but should be incorporated since the first phases of the design in the of the clinical trial, because we must pay very much attention to technology. That must be a facilitator and not a barrier between patient and investigators and other healthcare providers, because it should be a barrier if we don't manage adequately. And of course, we need strong involvement of patients since the first phases of planning of the trial project, and either the technology should be incorporated since these phases. And we need the involvement of patients to enhance trust and to hear the needings of the patients. We already, just a few minutes ago, Julian told us his perspective and the perspective of his son and patients. And of course, transparency for conflict of interest disclosures of investigators is a key point that should be reinforced and very clearly stated, even in the informed consent, to reinforce the trust and good execution of the studies. Next slide, please. And there are other issues. Everything is good, but there are some points that can be not some threats, but some we have to deal with. And digital technology gives us data, a huge amount of data, in a continuous and extensive fashion from patients, and with respect to traditional site clinical visits, that is not continuous but point by point. And this obviously offers many opportunities, but some threats. More data means more information. The continuous flow of data can give us the possibility to intercept earlier signs of alarm and enhance the safety and efficacy of data monitoring. But it should be managed. And a threat could be an overload of work for investigators. Next slide, please, and for the center. So we should find a balance between patient needs, obviously. For example, unscheduled visits or meetings for even simple questions that we should answer, and healthcare professional workflow. And probably identifying adequate and secure, possibly certificated platforms is needed. We know that the security of data is a key issue. I heard last week in Rome at a meeting on research, the head of national cybersecurity for Italy, that crime organization is moving from traditional crime to cybercrime, with the managing an incredible amount of data from electronic medical records and so on, is incredible. And there is a black market for this, and with many zeros. And another point that to me is very important is the training to use for the trial, for the new way of conducting trials with technologies and new tools, both for investigators and for patients. And this is crucial for the good development of the trial. I finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation and sharing your views on this. We will now start with the panel discussion to explore more and deeper the patient and investigator side perspective. And I'm very happy to, we have several representatives in the panel, and I'm very happy to present each of them. We have in our panel today Sally Hofmeister. She is a board member of the World Duchenne Organization and also has a function as alternate on the Patient Consumers Working Party. We have with us as well Aisling Walsh. She works as a senior project manager for EFCNI, which is in fact the first pan-European organization giving a voice to newborn patients and their families. And in that view, raising awareness on a wide range of adverse health outcomes for babies born too early and participating in preclinical and clinical studies as a PPI partner will be make the input as well. We have Mira Zuidgeest. She's an associate professor at the University Medical Center in Utrecht and academic lead for the IMI Trials at Home project. She's board member of the Get Real Institute and led the development of a decision support tool for randomized clinical trials integrated into routine clinical practice. And then we have Francisco Bautista, who is a clinical scientist at the Trial and Data Centrum in the Prinses Maxima Utrecht, which is an institution that centralized the clinical and research activity in pediatric cancer in the Netherlands. And they will all be in the panel, which will be moderated by Casper Bendix Johnson, who will moderate it. And Casper is, of course, a member of our EUDC project team and works at the Danish National Center for Ethics. So Casper, I give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Casper Jonsen, and I'm from the Danish National Center for Ethics, which is the central authority in Denmark running and supporting all the research ethical committees that are part of the approval process for any given clinical trial that anybody would want to perform in Denmark. I'm very happy to be able to moderate this, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity. I had hoped that we might have had 4 hours, Ditte, but I guess we will have to. To do with the next 45 or so minutes. I think the first part of today has at least illustrated a common agreement that everything should be focused on the well-being of the participants that take the risk of participating in a trial and participating in all of the activities. But we haven't really got too close to what actually is well-being for a participant, and also what does it mean to feel safe when participating in a trial, in the entire process from the informed consent and the feeling of being informed towards the true running of the trial and the activities that are going on. So first of all, Aisling, with your knowledge and what you know from your organization, what would you define as well-being, and what do you think is needed to be able to feel safe in this trial process?
Thank you, Casper. I'd just like to maybe explain a little bit that our foundation is the European Foundation for the Care of Newborn Infants. We, of course, mainly deal with patients who are still in the hospital, so any clinical studies that take place will always, obviously, at that point in time, be conducted in the hospital. However, this scope for decentralized clinical trials really opens up the perspective, and something that we really advocate for is the follow-up of these children as they grow up. So it will become increasingly important that they're followed up at home, and studies can be conducted with elements that can be done at home. So really, I would say the building block, and to answer your question about the well-being and safety on how patients feel safe at home really relies very, very heavily on the relationship between the investigator and the patient. And in our case, it's also the families that are involved. So really the scope of DCTs really opens up a new world, I would say, for the patients in our target group, in the sense that they can build a relationship with the investigator from their home. I would say, though, that the key word in my mind is flexibility. So really having the opportunity to meet the investigator face to face is extremely important, especially when this involves not just a patient, but also the family. So really what makes them feel comfortable is this open avenue for communication, whether that be on-site or from home, but also to increase accessibility of it. I think it's very important also to keep in mind what we've already discussed about access to technology, health literacy levels, so really addressing these issues as well. So I like this point about GPs becoming involved and how we can manage that, because I think the first contact for a lot of patients is really their GP, and also how to separate, you know, is this part of routine care or is this part of the clinical trial that they would participate in? So I really would like to emphasize that the patient-investigator relationship is absolutely key and really foundational for this.
Thank you, Hsing. Sally, in your organization, does relationship building take the same value as we just heard from Aisling?
Yes, I think so. It is really important to have a trusting relationship with an investigator that you know will listen to the concerns that the patients will have, whether it's about the risks of participating in clinical trials. We need, as families, because it's always a family concerned with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the family is involved almost the whole time through. You need to know that the investigator will listen to your concerns and address them adequately. So a personal relationship is important. On the other hand, any remote elements or decentralized elements that can be included in clinical trials make participation very much easier. It's just the same as Julian said, flexibility and choice is incredibly important, because you have some families who are really happy to only communicate via telephone and not go to the trial site very often, and manage maybe better to deal with their concerns and worries, whereas others are less confident about what's going on, more focused on maybe signs that have nothing to do with the investigational drug or whatever. On the other hand, in Duchenne, the trials are incredibly complicated, and in almost all of them, maybe not all, but a lot of them, there are so many factors that we do not know the answers to. So that always causes, so you desperately need to have a hotline, for example, 24/7, so that if something happens, might not have anything to do with the clinical trial, but it might. And you never know what the consequences might be. So, yeah.
But maybe as a follow-up question to you, Sally, you say that the relationship building is as important as Aisling just told us, but is that necessary to the investigator, and how far away could this investigator be? Would you be comfortable in a situation where the investigator might not be in the same country, or is the sort of clear red lines that simply cannot be passed?
Well, this is probably more a sort of personal opinion, but I think at least one time you should see the investigator face to face and be able to talk to him. And I don't believe you can build up a relationship of trust and confidence purely remotely. Maybe it's just because I'm too old for that, but
No, I absolutely 100% agree with Sally. I think it's extremely important that there's at least one meeting face-to-face with the investigator. It's really, I mean, we saw it throughout COVID. I mean, we can do Zoom meetings, we can do online meetings, but you cannot replace the face-to-face interaction and really to see the person and speak to them face-to-face, and so they can answer your questions, they can, you know, ease your concerns. So I really think that's, you know, we can't argue that that's essential. I would even go as far as saying that in the clinical trials that I've been involved in as part of EFCNI, we do and have developed training, like soft skills training for investigators on how to approach patients and their families. And I must say that these have always been not that well taken up. And I would imagine that going forward with DCTs, that would be an extremely important element that should be offered, training for investigators on soft skills, for example.
Julian, you mentioned the thing about continuous access and monitoring and sort of being able to respond very fast. In terms of being in a decentralized clinical trial, is there a perfect balance between maybe having this possibility of the continuous monitoring, maybe at a more and more central site, but there would be somebody actually looking at it. Is that a better case to you rather than having a more local investigator that might not have the same time and resources to respond to it? So where would you like this feedback from, this response from?
Unfortunately, I guess one size doesn't fit all, you know. And the key thing is, as Sally and Aislinn already mentioned, is to offer much more possibilities as possible to the patient. And because depending of the condition of the treatment, the need of contact changes. You know, for example, if your son is going to be involved in a gene therapy study, you will have a lot of questions, you know, because probably you need an intrathecal admission. If I will be on this situation, I will have a lot of questions. If your treatment is for you know, dermatologic issue and it's about using something, let's say, easy from a medical point of view, the need is totally different. So at some point, it will be nice to understand, you know, something that we can call the adherence of the patient to the physician in order to get this support and make sure we evaluate this adherence and this need and this dependency. I will say dependency. Sally already mentioned, when you are afraid, you want to talk to people. You don't want to talk to machines. I don't know if you have this problem in your country, but in Spain we have an issue with the banks and the electricity companies. When you are trying to call to customer support, you always have a machine, and it's impossible to talk to a human. Impossible, you know. I remember when in one clinical study, I have to report the adverse effects of my son every day, and I have to call a phone, and the phone was an automatic machine, repeating, you know, something for 10 minutes, and at the end I say, okay, it's fine, everything is okay. Doesn't make sense, you know. It will be better to, you know, improve this communication. But anyway, coming back to your point, the problem is super variable, and this should be part of the evaluation of the study, is to identify the dependencies of the patient from a communication point of view.
Mira, I saw your hand. Just one question to Francisco first. Francisco, do you foresee a future of participant enrollment that would sort of come with a catalog of how the trial activities could be done, and how many site visits, how many home visits and stuff? Do you foresee that this flexibility could actually be built into trials?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think from an investigator perspective, and I think for most of the attendees this meeting today. The main aim of clinical trials is to offer new possibilities for patients who have not other possibilities in most of the cases. And this issue is particularly relevant for pediatrics, where per definition most of the diseases are rare diseases. And therefore it's really, really important that the clinical trials are offered in the best way for patients so that they can access any treatment which is not accessible by any other way. And this is even more important in pediatric oncology, for instance. And we all realize that any mean that improves the recruitment of patients into clinical trials is very important, because we lag behind significantly from the development of new drugs for patients compared to the adult population. So decentralized clinical trials, or any tool that facilitates the accessibility for clinical trials to pediatric patients is very important. Even said that, my experience as a pediatric oncologist and a pediatrician differs, and I see differences in the needs and applicability of the centralized clinical trials and the portfolio you just mentioned between pediatric oncology and other pediatric disciplines. This also relates to the question before on the proximity of the investigator to the patients. In pediatric oncology, I have to say that we've got a very special relationship with our patients and the families. This is part of the context of the disease. And my experience, we always try to be as closest as possible to the patients, even if they are in the distance, and we try to make ourselves as much as available whenever they need us. So in a way, we've always implemented that kind of decentralization of relationship with the patients in our field, but also in pediatrics. It's very common, this way of behaving with the patient. I think this is different as well from other maybe adult specialties. So, well, coming back to your question, I definitely agree. So there is a way forward for implementing clinical trials in the pediatric field. But again, and I think I'm repeating some of the conclusions from my colleagues, that this depends on the pediatric specialty, and because not all of us physicians need the same, or in order to better implement this to our patients.
Thank you, Francisco. So in Denmark, when we wrote our guidance paper on what we saw as good research ethics in decentralized clinical trials, the same words came up all the time. It was trust, it was relationship building, and it was flexibility. So Mira, how do you work in implementing these aspects into decentralized trials?
Yes, so indeed, I was hoping I could still respond on this topic. I mainly speak from the experience we have setting up the radial trial, which is a trial that's not yet being conducted, but where we will be comparing a fully decentralized, a hybrid, and a conventional arm with people living with diabetes type 2. We have a lot of co-creation sessions when we were setting up the trial with people living with diabetes type 2. And what we saw there on what they wanted regarding involvement during the trial face-to-face meetings, that there was a lot of difference between people, and it was mainly involved 2 points. One is, how is the regular healthcare provider involved? And for some of that was very important. And for other, they said, well, I don't actually see my regular healthcare provider at all, so it doesn't really matter to me. And the other one was very important, is what are the ways I can contact the research team when something's the matter, both regarding care, but also regarding technologies. And what we're doing is, so I can imagine, and in that I completely agree what has been said before, it very much depends on the population, on the specific trial, whether you could actually do a fully remote interaction with the investigator. In radial, we said, well, it's for one part, it's going to be completely remote, but at least we want telemedicine visits where questions can be exchanged, and we want the regular healthcare provider involved. So we want to get their opinion both on eligibility of participants, which is a separate topic, I know, but also that they're informed on that people will be participating in this trial. I think we should not lose sight of that actual clinical care is also decentralizing. And we see that a lot in our hospital. And then, of course, there is an existing relationship already. But people are getting more and more used to interacting online and not always face to face, again, depending very much on the situation and the disease area.
So just a follow-up question to you, Mira. So you chose to have a full DCT arm in the radial trial, right? So I guess that means that you foresee that it has some sort of relevance at least. So could you comment on where you see a full DCT being a realistic thing?
Yes, of course. So what I really like about today is that everyone is interested in how DCTs can possibly be beneficial to participants, to sites. And I think I'm a researcher researching research, so to say. So basically, I think we need to drive this forward and to see where hybrid or where fully decentralized can be beneficial. We need to not only do that, but also really then investigate what do we see, what is patient satisfaction, what is site satisfaction. And we had the opportunity to try out a fully decentralized arm, which I don't think is the future for all types of IMPs, all types of research, but it will give us a lot of insights on both what's possible, but also what are the needs, what are the what are actually the preferences from investigators and participants on these types of trials.
Thank you. Felipe, or would you want to comment? Yeah, please.
I have some problem with the microphone. Just one comment. I perfectly agree with those ladies because we don't have to make a mistake. The relationship between patient and physician, investigators, and so on in a clinical trial should be the same that in the clinical routine. We don't have to make the mistake that in the clinical trial the relationship and the trust must be different. It's not. So a face-to-face interaction, at least sometimes at some point at the starting of the clinical study, when there is a collection of the informed consent, especially, and when the person has many questions to do, to me is crucial. And after then, we can find a balance and find the way to retrieve some tools from decentralized clinical trials to make a good job. But we have to think that the relationship must be the same.
Thank you, Felipe. Julian, you had a comment?
Just a couple of observations from a technical point of view. I'm a software engineer, I'm sorry. The thing is, something mentioned this morning, the bring my own device. Right? Bring my own device is something we use from a technical point of view in order we facilitate to the customers, to the users, the possibility of using their own devices and not providing another one, because, for example, if somebody is interested on capturing data, I would like to use my phone. I don't want to use another device, another laptop, another thing, right? It has to be done with something I'm already using right now. So bring my own device is something that it will be critical for the success of the clinical trial and also to facilitate the process to the patient. And from a technical point of view, it's possible. At the EMA, for example, the delegates of the EMA, we are using our own devices and we are working on confidential information, confidential documentation. It is possible. There is no technical restrictions for that. The other point is about interoperability. When we are capturing data, we have to make sure the data is interoperable. If not, it's going to be super difficult to reuse the data. Right now, we have interoperability options. We have HL7, we have, Fire, we have SNOMED, we have a lot of options right now. So please think about interoperability as a must. Just the last one is just to mention that the EMA has Darwin as the initiative in order to get data into the regulatory space from an harmonized point of view, using standards and using a standardized protocol to collect information. It will be important also that the next clinical studies will be, synchronized with Darwin and using the benefits that Darwin is going to provide to us as European citizens.
Thank you, Julian. So one of the best things about my work is that I get to interact with a lot of physician members of our ethical committees. So I also have sort of the full spectrum of people that are very concerned about DCTs and people that are overtly happy about DCTs and think they should be implemented everywhere. But one of the discussions that has come up again and again is in relation to informed consent. And actually some of our physicians in committees, they see a decentralized informed consent process actually as a positive thing, because, as they say, they know that they have power in a room. They know that they impact how the patient in front of them is actually behaving. So Filippo, just maybe a comment on that. Do you agree with this point, or is it just utter rubbish?
As already mentioned, I think that obviously informed consent is crucial. And as the first contact with the investigator and is a key moment to interact and to establish a relationship. And I think I don't agree with a fully decentralized clinical trial, especially even for the initial phases and the collection of the informed consent. And for me, a face-to-face interaction is needed, obviously. And so I think that I don't like this way. I like the traditional way in the first phases of a clinical trial, even of a decentralized clinical trial.
Julian?
But we can do both. I agree that at the beginning, the personal touch is needed. I totally agree. But we need to do both, because right now the situation is, in some situations, the informed consent is not information and is not consent. The investigator is just giving the paper to the patient. No, I'm not. No. Probably you are. This happens, And also another problem from my point of view is the conflict of interest of the investigator. If the investigator is receiving money from the company to do the clinical study, the investigator has an informed consent. A conflict of interest. And this is something. This is like the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to watch this elephant, but it's there. I've been in situations, the families told me, that the investigator changed the diagnosis of the patient just to make sure the patient was included in the clinical study. That this could happen.
Sally, it seems that you might have a comment on that.
Well, I just think that's something that has to be avoided at all costs, right? Just to imagine that your diagnosis is changed or some part of the physical examination or the results for the eligibility criteria are changed just so a patient can enter a trial, that's pretty dangerous. Can be, so, yeah.
Sally, but in relation to informed consent, would you be comfortable sort of trading the in-person meeting for the informed consent with maybe being able to participate in a trial at a highly specialized center far away? Is that some sort of is there a trade-off that you could accept?
That's rather difficult, and I think it depends a lot on what the clinical trial is about and what it implies. I can imagine there being a sort of combination of the two, right? So you have maybe a visit at the site where the investigator can explain as much as possible. You maybe have a third person in the room, some kind of counselor, genetic counselor, maybe, depending on what the objective is or what the population is, who is there and listens and can answer a lot of questions and also talk to the family, maybe without the principal investigator being in the room. So he explains everything he wants to explain, goes out, and this third person, whoever that may be, can ensure that the patient or the family, whichever is concerned, has actually understood, because these informed consent forms are quite often an absolute nightmare. And you also have to consider that patients or parents in the pediatric trials, they're so excited about actually getting into a trial and having access to investigational medicine, which might be years before it comes to the market. They're so excited about it and really want to do it without necessarily knowing all the details and what they might be risking. So I think that's a good alternative, to have somebody there. You could, of course, also do that remotely, but maybe a sort of mixture is a good idea. You have a face-to-face meeting, but then you have a follow-up meeting where people have been able to go home, talk to family members, maybe their own physician, about whether this is a good idea, whether it's a proper fit, and then do the consent remotely.
Francisco, you had a comment?
I just wanted to agree with what Sally has said, and that we shouldn't forget that it's key to remember this is a process, and it's not just one single one-time meeting where the signature is obtained at the end of the meeting. Like, it has to be a process. So we can start with an on-site meeting, and then the patients or the family can go home. They can think over what they've heard. They can ensure, perhaps with the help of a third party, as Sally has said, like oftentimes in our patient population, we'll have a psychologist present as well. So they can really consider and weigh up the risks and benefits of their child participating in such a study. So I think really key is remembering that it's a process, and that maybe we can have a face-to-face meeting, but the signature could possibly then be obtained at a later stage electronically.
Francisco?
Yeah, so I only have one comment. So at least in the Netherlands, it is written in the informed consents that you have the possibility to discuss with an independent investigator in the site. So that opens the possibility to have questions that you may not ask to the PI, for instance. So in some informed consents, you can find the reference to these people. Normally, there is said in the informed consent that you can always discuss with friends, physicians, which are outside the clinical trial. So my only concern about this is because the PI isn't responsible for what relates once the patient has signed informed consent. He's also responsible for what type of information he receives from people who is outside the clinical trial in a way. So I think also this needs to be accommodated and taken into account, because the patient needs to be informed, but more importantly, he needs to be very well informed of what the consequences and responsibilities of participating in a clinical trial are. So the people informing the patient needs to be trained, needs to be aware of what the clinical trial represents. So yeah, I understand that another opinion may be of very much value, but we also need to take this a little bit under control from my perspective as well.
That's some really good points, and I would say maybe the most often used consideration we sent regarding participant information is, please be a bit more specific of what can this study actually show, and what are actually the true chance of this being a success. Because it's I mean, I don't think that anybody would actually say no to an honest description of what is actually going to happen. Maybe switching a bit gear here, but Mira, did you have a comment to this first, or else I have a question? But please go comment first.
Yes, thank you. So I think it might be helpful to separate remoteness from trusting relationship at a certain point. I think in our discussion, sometimes we automatically assume that having a remote discussion, you can't have a trusted relationship. Whereas I think where we're heading, with a lot of people meeting each other online, never meeting in person, that can actually change. So that's one addition I would like to make. And I know it might be the future, we might not be there yet, but I think that's something we need to take into consideration, that we don't treat them as equal. Remoteness is always, you can't have a trusting relationship. And the other thing is indeed, and that has been mentioned several times, that I think if you do a remote consent, but the way we do it, for example, we share the information, we tell them, please discuss with your regular healthcare provider, with any person you want, whether this is a good idea for you, and then you have a remote meeting on questions, etc. I think that's a way that you can have the both, not for all studies, but for some.
And then a question for you, Mira. In building your trial, what kind of input did you get from patient organizations or investigators? How did you activate these people?
Yeah, so we do have patient organizations as part of our consortium, so they've been involved from the start. And then in the early phases, we set up an external stakeholder panel and a patient expert panel who are, they have a CDA, so we're able to share really detailed information about the project at each stage with them. And basically, they've been involved from determining what the endpoints would be. They did protocol reviews. They're, especially the patient expert panel is also looking at the training materials that we are developing. So we're in an iterative process working together, and they're in our annual meetings. So it's really a co-creation approach in that sense. And it led to us adding or changing things in our trial. For example, we added a patient-reported outcome because the patient said that's really important for us, and it's not a difficult outcome to add. Why are you not doing that? And in discussions with investigators, we really discuss a lot of the nitty-gritty of how you operationalize decentralized elements, because I think we all agree that they are interesting, but then the operationalization can be quite difficult still. So there we have a lot of discussions back and forth on how that works in practice.
Were there any disagreements between what would be the best scientific way to go, or what would be the most flexible way for any patient being on the trial?
Yeah, so what I liked in these discussions is that flexibility would really be helpful if that's part of a trial, and we really discussed that at the start. Can we add that patients could choose which arm they would be in, but then you kind of lose the part where you're comparing them, because preference can really influence the outcomes. So we took that along because we see how important it is. So besides our radial study, we're doing a discrete choice experiment, so a patient preference study to determine more of those preferences for the different decentralized approaches. But of course, there's always things where there's a lot of nice to haves that you would like to add to a decentralized trial because it's interesting and we have new technologies. We really try to focus on, is this a nice to have, or is it a need to have to test the decentralized approach?
Filippo?
See, I have two questions for Mira. I would like to know which was the mean age for of the patients in your radio trial, and if you have reporting about patient satisfaction about this.
Yes, so the minimum age is 18 years in this specific trial, also due to the IMP that we're using, and also due to that this is a pilot. Sorry? Oh, the mean. Well, the trial hasn't started yet, so the minimum is 18, and there's no maximum. Your second question was about
patient satisfaction.
Yeah, so that's actually this trial, given that it's a methodological trial, actually key performance indicators are our primary outcomes and not the clinical outcomes, and site satisfaction and patient satisfaction are among the main KPIs that we're researching, because I think they will help determine whether DCT approaches will be acceptable and then moving forward in the future or not. So we're doing that after each trial phase. So we're looking at patient satisfaction after the enrollment phase, during the follow-up phase, and after closing of the trial.
And how did you find a balance between patients' request of intervention or contacts with the centers and the investigators?
So how do we balance
yes,
that?
the request of contacts by the patients and the possibility of the centers to respond, to answer to questions.
So what we at least, of course, we need to have the processes in place that if there's any unexpected events, anything, that there's a very clear process on how that's being dealt with. Regarding preferences, well, really what we are, that's why we have the fully decentralized arm, where there is interaction through telemedicine visits, through apps, and you can always call the site. Then there's the hybrid arm where they come in on site for the first visit, then they're followed up remotely, and then the last visit is on site again, and then this complete conventional arm. And really we're trying to figure out what the preferences are by asking them about how they want, how satisfied they are. So we set a certain level, and of course it's only a proof of concept study, so there's only one way we can do that for each arm. And really this is one of the things that we're trying to investigate. What are the experiences with that? And in that separate preference study, we will ask specifically solicit preferences. Would you, for this and this trial, want to come to site, do this completely remotely or not?
Thank you.
So time is really running out, but there's one point I think we should have brought up at least for a few seconds. So Francisco, we had Julian explaining the Excel qualifications of EU physicians and using that sort of as leverage to say that education is needed, and it's a point being brought up by several today. So do physicians, generally speaking, need a course in decentralization?
Well, what relates to the use of technology or certain technologies, definitely yes. We are all not used to use the same degree of devices or applications in the phone or whatever. So this really needs to be kind of taught to the investigators, not only physicians, but also nurses and whoever is part of the medical or the investigator team. And obviously, it depends on how you are, how old are you, and all these things, which makes a difference on your capability to use these new technologies. For upcoming decentralized clinical trials where we are going to use that kind of devices, this is definitely needed, that we get appropriate training on the use of new technologies. And I see in my daily practice in here or in another countries that, yeah, there is certainly a variability in the degree of, confidence on the use of these technologies, but not only Excel, but whoever has Teams or any other communication tool. So yeah, definitely.
Julian, maybe a final comment on education and the patient perspective?
Yeah, the question from Dr. Pirali triggered me one topic, which is patient satisfaction, because after participating in 2 clinical studies, nobody called me to check how the study was done. And I guess we really need to work together to make sure the feedback loop is closed for each clinical study, to make sure we are capturing the feedback from the patient, because right here we are represented debilitating conditions with mortality, Duchenne, newborn, cancer, you know what I mean? And sometimes finding a cure is not possible. And when patients are going into a clinical study, most of the times we are looking for hope, and at some point it's not important. Okay, we can live with that. The treatment maybe is not working, but I will never forget how I feel. And this is something we need to capture and make sure is included in the evaluation of the clinical study. probably.
Thank you very much, Julian. So as far as I'm concerned, we passed our time now. So I think that we should give a round of applause to the panel for their fantastic input. And then I would give the word back to Greet.
Okay, so thanks a lot for the very rich discussion and sharing this with us. So we will try to wrap up. So I will start with the main observations made during this session. So first we had Julian, who really pointed out clinical trial hybrid is possible, but it should be inclusive for all patients. The need for the data protection and the ownership of the data, so the feedback loop to the patient to say so is really important. Then we had the point of view of the investigator by Dr. Pieralli. Okay, patients and clinicians are open to DCT elements. An important thing I think you mentioned personally is the fact that patient engagement, and it has been mentioned by all of you, I think, and at the early stage of development is really key. And I'm a real believer in that. I think I saw the Duchenne patient organization doing a marvelous job in the COMP as a pioneer, in fact, and I really think we should take this through. The balance need between the patient's needs and the investigator workload, to say so. I think that's also an important one. 3 main points you mentioned. The adequate and secure electronic platforms, that's of course a key thing. And the training needed as well for the investigators as the patients before starting the trial. Then the rich discussion we had on the panel, the main points which restricted my mind is the flexibility and the choice should be there. At least one face-to-face meeting, although we say relationship and remote, we should perhaps differentiate a bit and see it as a whole, and also to see it, I learned it from Mira, as a kind of iterative process, perhaps too. Also, one size doesn't fit all, so we should really tailor it to the disease and the needs of the patients towards a communication point of view. Another important issue, in my view, is also the specificity of some, if you said for pediatrics, for instance, rare diseases, for oncology, we go more through a model where access to trials is also therapy at the same time. And I think that's really an evolution we see in our current world, and we should take this, I think, in our mind as well. Trust, relationship building, and flexibility, the 3 buzzwords we heard, I think, systematically during this discussion. Co-creation with the patient, I really love that too. And I think that these were a lot of informed consent and iterative process, but these were a bit my main observations. Peter, so I hand over to you.
So, I guess it's the concept of having more than one peer reviewer, isn't it? And so some of the things I'm going to say are overlapping and some are not. And I'm not going to try and be comprehensive, but a few things that caught my ear this morning. The world is changing fast, and clinical trials are changing fast. And I think that's why we're here today. Today is an exercise in listening to stakeholders on decentralized, remote, or whatever we're going to call them in the future, clinical trials, to feed in to a version 1.0 of a recommendation paper, which will be a living document over time. And I strongly feel that we should have more multi-stakeholder engagement, perhaps under the auspices of ACT-EU's multi-stakeholder platform in 2023 and beyond, to make sure that evolves as quickly as the world is changing. Obviously focused on our ultimate goal, which is bigger, better clinical trials for patient access and safer and effective use of medicines, and perhaps also meeting the hope with delivery. Actually, Julian, I liked your intervention a lot. I thought what was interesting, and I was very taken by the panel discussion on both things that were common and things that were different. And I would imagine that the recommendations paper will come up with some principles that can guide, but actually the application of those principles will be very situation specific. I was taken with diseases specific, the population is specific, and the treatment is specific. So a neonate or somebody with a life-threatening chronic disease is going to be very different from, I don't know, mild to moderate dermatological condition, for example, in terms of how it would work and what the patient might like and how what the clinician might like. I love Mira. I'm head of data analytics and methods, Mira. So I love the concept of research into research, if you like, and having an evidence-based way of informing our decisions and our best practice in the future. So long may it continue, and I hope your project is very successful. And I hope there are many more projects that are complementary going forward. I think this is an area that should be funded and supported. Go to the CRO's quality by design and patients in the design, I think were two key messages that came out this morning. Also, it was particularly emphasized in the CRO interventions, but let's harmonize. We have a clinical trials regulation. It's one set of rules for Europe. We understand there's a big national legacy, and we understand that not everything at the moment is harmonized. So let's have transparency on the disharmonized bits in order to help people navigate. But the goal, the direction of travel must be harmonization at European level to facilitate big, effective, impactful clinical trials. I think I want to say on behalf of ACT-EU, we're all at this end of the table in a way wearing an ACT-EU hat, that we should be ambitious in what we try to achieve. And I come back to the point on data protection. Let's try and tackle it in the years to come, rather than just saying, ooh, that's very difficult, isn't it? And the last thing I would say is we're going to have to go step by step, even if they're fast steps. And I come back to a multi-stakeholder platform under ACT-EU to deliver bigger, better clinical trials for patients. So those were my observations. I hand back to Greet because we're doing a little bit of a cabaret in our closing remarks here.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Remains me to give many thanks. So I will start by thank you, Peter. I know you have a very busy agenda, so it's really welcome that you are here with us today in your positive dynamics. So that's really appreciated. I would also like to thank Dieter, our project manager. I'm really proud because she really did a marvelous job in a very difficult, challenging environment, you know, where we have that many stakeholders. So thanks a lot, Dieter, but also a huge thank you to Monique and Solange, who worked together with the whole project team on the recommendation paper. Not easy to find the balance and really to strive that we have it published hopefully before Christmas, as Peter said. Thanks to Tina as well, who helped a lot with Dieter on the project management. So thanks a lot for that, Stina, I should say, sorry. And then a huge thank you also to the EMA colleagues, to Anna, to Ais, to Marianne, to Jackie, and all the EMA staff who really helped a lot in making this possible. I know it's on top of other activities, but it's really much appreciated. Thanks to all the speakers and the panelists. I really think it was a really rich discussion and open discussion we had, and which is a good start for the breakout sessions later in the afternoon. And thank you also to all the people listening in virtually and who worked also in the back and who are perhaps not present here. So thank you all. I will give the word to Dieter.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just turning to a few of a bit of a housekeeping comments, some more practicalities. Jackie, if you could take the next slide, I think, and next again. Just, yeah. Okay, yes. I mean, from my perspective, that was a closing of the virtual setting, but...
So just to say thank you on behalf of EMA as host to those that are following virtually. We're now going to just give some instructions for the afternoon non-plenary sessions, and also some logistics for lunch. So if anybody's remote, I mean, if you're interested, continue to listen. But otherwise, we're now into nitty-gritty and logistics. So thank you very much. We can make things better, and I think if we collaborate together, we will. Thank you. Back to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, obviously, we also do want to thank you on behalf of the project team as well. We are very excited, but also looking very much forward to the breakouts, I think, on site this afternoon. But I think we have said all the thanks.